The dynasty that would come to be known as Plantagenet did not arrive in England bearing the promise of peace or the careful diplomacy of a restrained monarchy, but descended instead upon a kingdom already broken by civil war, carrying with it the volatile inheritance of Anjou, Normandy, and Aquitaine, and the particular genius for catastrophe that seemed encoded in the blood of every lord who bore the golden lions of that house. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. The Plantagenet kings, who ruled England from the accession of Henry II in 1154 to the deposition of Richard II in 1399, presided over 2.5 centuries of extraordinary governance, military expansion, legal innovation, and cultural flowering, and they did so while simultaneously generating a body of scandal, treachery, murder, and moral catastrophe that no subsequent dynasty has quite managed to equal in either scale or intimacy. The scandals that emerged from this royal house were not the petty indiscretions of courtiers or the private vices of minor lords, but transgressions of a specific and devastating kind. Acts that implicated the very highest levels of power in England and France, that cost archbishops their lives, that set sons against fathers, that drove queens to treason, that produced bastard lines whose claims would destabilize the kingdom for generations, and that ultimately unraveled the most formidable concentration of territorial power in the medieval West. To understand these scandals is not merely to indulge in the appeal of historical transgression, but to understand something fundamental about the nature of medieval kingship itself, which was an institution built upon the permanent tension between the exercise of absolute power and the web of obligations, loyalties, and Christian moral teaching within which that power was theoretically constrained. The landscape of Plantagenet England was itself a kind of theatre for the dramas that unfolded within it. A kingdom of approximately 2 million people in the reign of Henry II, spread across a territory of field and forest and fen, connected by roads that had in many cases been laid by Roman engineers more than 1,000 years earlier, governed by a church of enormous wealth and independent jurisdiction whose relationship to the crown had never been satisfactorily resolved, and administered by a feudal hierarchy whose loyalties were simultaneously local, dynastic, ecclesiastical, and personal in ways that made any simple account of where power resided in any given moment fundamentally misleading. The towns of this England, Winchester and York and Lincoln and Norwich and Bristol, were modest by continental standards, and the City of London, which was beginning to assert its commercial and political significance with increasing forcefulness through the 12th and 13th centuries, held perhaps 25,000 people in the reign of Henry II, and had grown to perhaps 80,000 by the time of Edward III. The royal court itself was not a fixed institution located in a single palace, but a mobile household that travelled continuously through the kingdom and across the Channel, consuming the revenues of royal manors, administering justice in the localities it visited, and carrying with it the entire machinery of governance in a train of carts and pack horses that might stretch for miles along the rutted roads of medieval England. It was within this mobile, tense, perpetually observed world that the darkest acts of the Plantagenet century were conceived, committed, and eventually exposed to the judgment of contemporaries and of history. The first, and in many ways the most consequential scandal of the Plantagenet era, was not a murder or an adultery or a financial corruption, though all of these would follow in abundance, but a conflict of jurisdiction so fundamental and so passionately pursued that it ended in the death of an archbishop in his own cathedral and transformed the political landscape of England and the papacy for decades afterward. Thomas Beckett, who had been born in London around 1118 to a Norman merchant family of modest prosperity, had risen through the patronage networks of Theobald of Bec, the Archbishop of Canterbury, to become one of the most accomplished administrators in England, and it was through Theobald's recommendation that he had come to the attention of Henry II, who appointed him Chancellor of England in 1155, a position of such intimacy with the king and such administrative authority that Becket became, in effect, the second most powerful man in the kingdom. The friendship that developed between Henry and Beckett during the 7 years of Beckett's chancellorship was one of the defining relationships of the 12th century, and its extraordinary warmth, which contemporary observers noted with the kind of detail usually reserved for descriptions of royal marriages, makes what followed not merely politically significant, but humanly devastating, in a way that purely institutional conflicts rarely achieve. They hunted together and dined together. They argued and debated, and reportedly engaged in the kind of rough, physical play that characterized male aristocratic bonding in the 12th century. And Henry came to regard Beckett with a degree of personal trust that he extended to very few men throughout his long and turbulent reign. It was precisely this intimacy that made Henry's decision to appoint Beckett as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162 so catastrophically miscalculated, because what Henry had anticipated was that his chancellor, now elevated to the primacy of the English Church, would continue to act as an instrument of royal policy in the sphere of ecclesiastical administration, bringing to the resolution of the long-standing conflicts between Crown and Church the same administrative brilliance and personal loyalty that had characterized his years as Chancellor, and what Henry received instead was a transformation of character so complete and so rapid that contemporaries struggled to account for it in terms that did not invoke the supernatural. Beckett resigned the chancellorship immediately upon his consecration, adopted the severe ascetic practices of a committed reforming churchman, and began to defend with a tenacity that surpassed anything Henry had ever encountered from a subject the full independence of ecclesiastical courts, the immunities of the clergy, and the right of the English Church to maintain its connections to Rome without royal interference, which was precisely the cluster of issues that Henry most urgently wanted resolved in favour of royal authority. The constitutions of Clarendon, which Henry presented to the English bishops in January of 1164, were a document of 16 articles that sought to codify what Henry claimed were the established customs governing the relationship between Crown and Church in England, and they represented the most systematic attempt by any English king to that point to define and limit ecclesiastical jurisdiction, restricting in particular the ability of clergy accused of crimes to escape royal justice by claiming the protection of church courts, which could not impose the death penalty and which Henry regarded as scandalously lenient in their treatment of criminal clerics. Beckett's initial acquiescence to the constitutions, which he subsequently withdrew and repudiated, plunged him into the most severe crisis of conscience of his life and set in motion the chain of events that would lead inexorably to the darkest act of the reign. The conflict between Henry and Beckett consumed 6 years from 1164 to 1170, years that saw Beckett flee into exile in France in November of 1164, years of negotiation and apparent reconciliation, followed by renewed rupture, years during which the Pope and the King of France were drawn into the dispute as intermediaries whose own interests complicated every attempt at settlement, and years during which Henry's rage at what he experienced as his former friend's treachery deepened into something that contemporaries, who were accustomed to the violent tempers of Angevin kings, found genuinely alarming. When Beckett finally returned to England in December of 1170, it was not in the spirit of the careful reconciliation that the papal legates and the French king had laboured to broker, but in a mood of confrontational defiance that included the excommunication of several English bishops who had cooperated with Henry during his exile, an act that was received at the Norman court where Henry was keeping Christmas as something close to a declaration of renewed hostilities. Henry's response, reported by 4 separate chroniclers of the period and quoted in varying forms by all of them, was an outburst of furious frustration, a cry of anguished rage at the company of men who surrounded him, demanding to know who would rid him of this turbulent priest, or words to that general and devastating effect. And 4 knights of the court, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton, took that outburst as a commission and rode immediately for Canterbury. They arrived at Canterbury on the 29th of December, 1170, in the late afternoon, and what followed in the cathedral that evening constitutes one of the most documented acts of violence in all of medieval history, described in accounts by eyewitnesses of extraordinary detail and horror, accounts that record the conversation between the knights and the archbishop in the cloisters, the movement of the parties through the darkening cathedral, the strikes of the swords, the behaviour of the monks who were present, and the final blow by which Richard le Breton, according to the monk Edward Grimm, who was present and was himself wounded, struck the archbishop's skull so violently that the sword broke on the pavement and scattered the brains and blood across the stone floor. Beckett died kneeling with his hands folded in the attitude of prayer, and the shock that radiated outward from Canterbury throughout the Christian world in the days and weeks that followed was of a magnitude that even the most catastrophically miscalculated act of a 12th century king could not have anticipated. Henry II's penance at Canterbury in July of 1174, when he dismounted outside the city and walked barefoot to the cathedral where Becket had been murdered, submitting to the ritual scourging of the monks and spending a night of prayer and fasting at the tomb, was not merely a diplomatic gesture calculated to end the papal sanctions that had descended upon England following the murder, though it was also that, but a genuine if complex act of a man who had spent 4 years confronting what his rage had produced, and who understood, with whatever portion of his intelligence he could bring to bear upon his own acts, that the death of Thomas Becket had compromised everything he had hoped to achieve in the great project of Plantagenet governance. The murder of Becket was not the end of the struggle between Crown and Church in England, but it transformed that struggle permanently, because Becket's canonization in 1173, 3 years after his death, created at Canterbury a pilgrimage site of international significance that was simultaneously a permanent memorial to royal violence and a continuous assertion of the Church's ultimate independence from royal control, a shrine that would draw pilgrims and revenues to Canterbury for 3.5 centuries, until Henry VIII, who had his own reasons for wanting to destroy monuments to ecclesiastical independence, dissolved the shrine in 1538 and scattered the saint's bones. The scandal of Becket's murder cannot be separated from the deeper scandal of what it revealed about the nature of power in Plantagenet. England, which was that the king's absolute authority, which was in practice far from absolute and was everywhere constrained by custom, feudal obligation, and ecclesiastical immunity, was nevertheless capable of generating, through the expression of unchecked personal rage, the deaths of men whom no political or legal calculus would have sanctioned, and that the king's capacity for violence existed in permanent tension with the moral and institutional framework within which kingship was supposed to operate. This tension, which was the structural condition of medieval monarchy rather than a peculiarity of the Angevin temperament, would produce the scandals of the next 2.5 centuries with something approaching inevitability, because every Plantagenet king who followed Henry II inherited both the extraordinary concentration of power that the Angevins had assembled and the institutional, personal, and theological contradictions that made its exercise so perpetually dangerous. The rebellion of 1173 and 1174, which saw Henry II's 3 eldest sons, the young King Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, rise against their father in a coordinated military campaign that drew in the King of Scotland, the Count of Flanders, and numerous disaffected English barons, and which also involved, in circumstances that remain imperfectly understood by historians, the active encouragement, if not outright coordination, of Henry's queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, constitutes the greatest domestic scandal of the 12th century in England, and one that illustrates with painful clarity the specific catastrophes that could arise from the Plantagenet system of territorial distribution. Henry had, in the manner of continental dynastic practice, crowned his eldest son as junior king in 1170, intending to secure the succession and give the young king an established position, but had simultaneously refused to grant him any actual administrative power or territorial revenue, a contradiction that produced in the young king a festering resentment that was assiduously cultivated by the French court, where Louis VII of France had every interest in destabilizing his most formidable neighbour. The rebellion was militarily unsuccessful. The young king and his brothers were brought to terms in September of 1174 after Henry's comprehensive military response, and Henry demonstrated in the settlement a political generosity that surprised contemporaries and that reflects his consistent pattern of severity in battle and moderation in its aftermath. But the psychological damage of the rebellion, the knowledge that his sons had sought to overthrow him and that his wife had been among the architects of that attempt, never left Henry, and Eleanor's subsequent imprisonment at various royal residences for the remaining 15 years of Henry's life. A confinement that was comfortable by the standards of the period but was nonetheless a genuine deprivation of liberty, stands as the most sustained act of personal vengeance of his reign. The imprisonment of Eleanor of Aquitaine raises questions about the nature of queenly power in the Plantagenet period that illuminate the structural position of women within a dynastic system that both required their participation and regarded their independent agency with profound suspicion. Eleanor had been, during the active years of her queenship from 1154 to 1173, an administrator of genuine competence and authority, governing England as regent during Henry's prolonged absences in France and Normandy, attesting royal charters with a frequency that places her among the most active participants in Plantagenet governance of any individual, and maintaining through her control of the revenues of Aquitaine a degree of financial independence that no English queen consort before her had possessed. Her encouragement of the rebellion appears to have stemmed from multiple sources, from genuine political disagreement with Henry's handling of their sons' territorial expectations, from the accumulated resentments of a 20-year marriage that had long since lost whatever affection had originally attended it, and from a calculation, which proved entirely incorrect, that the coordinated military pressure of her sons and their French and Flemish allies was sufficient to force a fundamental restructuring of the Plantagenet territorial settlement. The failure of the rebellion and the subsequent imprisonment were therefore not merely the personal tragedy of a woman who had overreached, but a lesson, absorbed by every subsequent Queen of England, about the precise limits of female political agency within a system that made queens instrumentally necessary to the production of heirs and the transmission of territorial claims, while reserving all final authority for the king. What made Eleanor's story scandalous to contemporaries was not the imprisonment itself, which was a legitimate, if severe, exercise of royal authority over a subject who had committed what was legally, if not technically, treason, but the transformation it represented in a figure who had been one of the most celebrated women of the 12th century, a duchess who had been Queen of France before she was Queen of England, who had accompanied the Second Crusade to the Holy Land in 1148 in circumstances that had generated accusations of adultery with her uncle Raymond of Poitiers, accusations that have never been proven and that may have been politically motivated, and who had presided over the most celebrated literary and courtly culture in Western Europe at her court at Poitiers in the years between 1168 and 1173. The troubadour poets who gathered at her court, men like Bernard de Ventadorn and Chrétien de Troyes, who was associated with the court of her daughter Marie of Champagne, composed a literature of refined and adulterous love that was simultaneously a celebration of female authority over male desire and a fantasy of social inversion in which the rules of feudal hierarchy were temporarily suspended within the pale, enclosed world of courtly romance. That this queen, whose court had celebrated love as the supreme value, should die in prison would have been the dark ending of a chivalric tale. But Eleanor did not die in prison, because Henry II died first, in July of 1189, broken by the final rebellion of his surviving sons, in which even his beloved youngest child John had joined the conspiracy against him, and it was Richard who released her. Richard I's release of his mother and her subsequent resumption of political activity at the age of 67 constitutes one of the most remarkable re-emergences in medieval political history and belongs to a different chapter in the Plantagenet story. But the decade of Henry II's final years, from 1174 to 1189, was itself dense with scandal of a different and more intimate kind. The death of the young King Henry in June of 1183, dying of dysentery at the castle of Martel while in active rebellion against his father, and the death of Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, in August of 1186. Killed in a tournament in Paris in circumstances that some contemporary accounts describe as a genuine accident, and others hint may have involved the kind of violent excess that the tournament culture of the period regularly produced, deprived Henry of 2 of his 4 legitimate sons, and left the succession in the hands of Richard, whose relationship with his father was characterized by mutual suspicion and intermittent hostility, and John, the youngest, whom Henry loved with a partiality that his other sons regarded as evidence of the irrationality that paternal affection regularly produces. Henry's persistent attempts in the final years of his reign to favour John at Richard's expense, attempting to secure territories for John that Richard regarded as his by right and expectation, drove Richard into the arms of Philip II of France with consequences that proved fatal, because it was the military alliance of Richard and Philip that destroyed the last military coherence of Henry's position in the summer of 1189 and produced the final defeat from which Henry never recovered. The scandal of financial corruption, which appears in the Plantagenet story with remarkable frequency, and which has received proportionally less attention from popular historians than the more dramatic crimes of murder and adultery, was embedded in the structural conditions of medieval royal government from its foundation. The system of royal finance, in the 12th and 13th centuries, depended upon the collection of revenues through a network of sheriffs, bailiffs, and other local officials whose opportunities for personal enrichment were numerous and whose supervision was necessarily limited by the administrative capacity of a royal government that lacked the bureaucratic infrastructure of a modern state. The Pipe Rolls, which are the annual accounts of the English Exchequer from 1156 onward, and which constitute one of the most remarkable administrative records of any medieval kingdom, document not only the revenues collected and the expenses disbursed, but the systematic manipulation of royal finance by officials at every level of the hierarchy, the underreporting of revenues, the inflation of expenses, the conversion of royal resources to personal use, and the elaborate systems of favoritism and bribery through which royal patronage was distributed and royal justice was bought and sold. Richard Fitzneel, who served as Treasurer of England under Henry II and wrote the Dialogus de Scaccario, the Dialogue of the Exchequer, around 1179, provides in that document a candid account of the Exchequer's operations that illuminates both the sophistication of the system and the systematic corruption that the system simultaneously generated and attempted to control. The corruption of the judiciary, which Magna Carta would attempt to address in 1215, with its famous clauses establishing that justice would not be sold, denied, or delayed, was a structural feature of a legal system in which the administration of justice was itself a revenue-generating activity of the Crown, and in which the fees charged for access to royal courts, the fines imposed for procedural irregularities, and the purchase of royal writs without which no legal proceeding could advance, created a permanent market in judicial services that inevitably attracted those willing to pay more for better outcomes. The judges who travelled the circuits of the English counties in the 12th and 13th centuries, dispensing the common law that Henry II's legal reforms had done so much to systematise and extend, operated in an environment in which the line between legitimate fees for judicial services and outright bribery was neither clearly drawn nor consistently enforced, and the records of judicial heirs, the periodic visitations of royal justices to the counties, document cases of corruption with a frankness that reflects both the regularity of the offence and the Crown's periodic attempts to prosecute it. The heir of 1175, which Henry II dispatched to investigate precisely these abuses following the complaints generated by the rebellion of 1173 and 1174, resulted in the removal of numerous sheriffs and the imposition of substantial fines upon officials who had abused their positions. But the structural conditions that produced corruption were not reformed by these measures, and the problem recurred with each generation. The reign of Richard I, who spent fewer than 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, and who regarded the kingdom primarily as a source of revenue to fund his crusading and continental military ambitions, produced scandals of a different but related kind. because the extraordinary fiscal demands that Richard's absence placed upon English society generated both the abuses of the Regency administration and the resentments that would eventually crystallize into the baronial reform movements of the 13th century. Richard's departure on the Third Crusade in 1189 required the most extensive fiscal mobilization that England had seen since the conquest, the so-called Saladin Tithe of 1188, imposed in the final year of Henry II's reign to fund the crusade, had demanded a tenth of all income and movable property from the entire population, clergy and laity alike, and had generated both substantial revenue and widespread evasion, complaint, and ultimately the kind of fiscal resentment that always attaches to taxation imposed without adequate consultation. The additional revenues that Richard raised through the systematic sale of royal offices, privileges, and charters in 1189 before his departure were equally extensive and equally controversial, and the famous remark attributed to Richard that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer, which appears in several chronicle sources in varying forms, and which may or may not have been spoken exactly as recorded, captures the essential character of a reign in which the kingdom's resources were treated with a cavalier disregard that his subjects found difficult to reconcile with even the most generous understanding of crusading obligation. The captivity of Richard I in the winter of 1192 and 1193, when he was seized by Duke Leopold of Austria on his return from the Holy Land, in circumstances that constituted a flagrant violation of the Church's protection of crusaders, and subsequently transferred to the custody of Emperor Henry VI of Germany, who recognized in his captive a political asset of extraordinary value, generated in England a financial scandal of epic proportions. The ransom of 100,000 marks of silver that the emperor demanded for Richard's release, which was eventually raised to 150,000 marks in some accounts, represented approximately twice the annual revenue of the English crown and required a fiscal effort that touched every level of English society, from the great lords who contributed according to their revenues to the monasteries that were compelled to surrender their reserves of gold and silver plate, and the clergy who paid a quarter of their annual income. The administration of this ransom collection, which was managed in England by Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had resumed her political role with extraordinary energy after Henry's death, and by the justiciar Walter of Coutances, was conducted with a thoroughness that bordered on the ruthless and generated complaints from every quarter of English society about the methods by which contributions were assessed and collected. The darker scandal of Richard's captivity lay not in the ransom itself, which was an unfortunate but comprehensible consequence of crusading travel through hostile territory, but in the behavior of John during his brother's absence, which included negotiations with Philip of France that amounted to something very close to treason, offers to support Philip's territorial claims in Normandy in exchange for recognition of John's position in England that, had they been successfully consummated, would have dismembered the Angevin Empire that Henry II had spent his entire reign assembling. John's treachery during his brother's captivity was neither complete nor ultimately successful, partly because the English barons and the Church under Archbishop Hubert Walter maintained a loyalty to Richard that John's blandishments could not entirely overcome, and partly because Philip's own military position in Normandy was not yet strong enough to make the deal that John offered reliably enforceable, but it established a pattern of behavior in John that would characterize his subsequent reign with devastating consistency, and that makes his accession to power in 1199, after Richard's death from a crossbow wound received at the minor siege of Chalus-Chabrol, one of the more appalling dynastic transitions of the medieval period. John's reign, which lasted from 1199 to 1216, and which ended with a baronial rebellion that invited the French Prince Louis to claim the English throne, and, with John's death from dysentery at Newark, while his kingdom was being militarily contested around him, is the most comprehensively scandalous reign of the entire Plantagenet dynasty, and the scandals that it generated were not peripheral episodes in an otherwise stable administration, but structural expressions of a character and governance style that made catastrophe nearly inevitable. The murder, or more probably the murder, of Arthur of Brittany in 1203, Arthur being John's nephew and the son of his elder brother Geoffrey, who had maintained a rival claim to the Plantagenet inheritance, supported by Philip of France and a significant body of continental baronial opinion, exemplifies the essential quality of Johnian scandal, which is that it combined genuine political calculation with a degree of personal brutality that destroyed the political advantage that the calculation was meant to secure. Arthur had been captured at the siege of Mirabeau in August of 1202, where Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her 80th year, had been besieged by Arthur's forces, and where John had executed one of the most impressive military movements of his reign, covering the 80 miles between Le Mans and Mirabeau in approximately 48 hours, and achieving a complete surprise that captured Arthur and 200 of his knights in a single stroke. It was the finest military achievement of John's reign, and it transformed the political situation of the continental Plantagenet possessions almost overnight, and John destroyed its effects within months by his treatment of the prisoners, many of whom were starved to death or otherwise mistreated in the royal prisons, and by the fate of Arthur himself. Arthur disappeared from the historical record in the spring of 1203, held in the castle of Rouen, and the circumstances of his death, which no contemporary source describes with any directness, were the subject of persistent rumour and accusation for the remaining years of John's reign and for long afterward. The most detailed account appears in the Chronicle of the Anonymous of Bethune, written some years after the event, which describes John as personally present at Arthur's death, which it characterises as a murder committed under the influence of wine, and which describes the disposal of Arthur's body in the Seine with a stone attached, an account whose details cannot be verified, but whose general narrative that Arthur was killed on John's orders and that John was directly implicated in the act was widely believed by contemporaries and appears to have been a significant factor in the defection of Norman and Breton barons to Philip of France in 1203 and 1204. The loss of Normandy in 1204, which stripped the Plantagenet dynasty of the duchy that had been the foundation of their power and their identity since the conquest, and which was the direct consequence of the baronial defections that Arthur's treatment had provoked, was the single greatest territorial catastrophe of the entire Plantagenet period, and one whose political effects reverberated through the rest of the dynasty's history. The scandal of John's relationship with his barons, which culminated in the revolt that began in 1215 and produced Magna Carta, was embedded in a governance style that combined genuine administrative competence. John was a more capable administrator than his popular reputation suggests, with a systematic contempt for the feudal conventions and personal dignities of the baronial class that made his government feel, to those who experienced it, like a continuous series of humiliations and arbitrary impositions. John's use of hostages, the taking of the children or close relatives of barons as guarantees of their loyalty, which was a practice not unknown in the 12th century, but which John employed with a frequency and an occasional callousness that alarmed even those who regarded the practice as legitimate in principle, created a climate of fear and resentment that pervaded the baronial class throughout his reign. His manipulation of feudal wardships and marriages, the right of the crown to administer the estates of minor heirs and to arrange their marriages, was another source of systematic grievance, because John used these rights not merely to collect the revenues that were the legitimate perquisite of feudal overlordship, but to extort additional payments from families anxious to redeem their heirs, or to escape marriages that the crown was threatening to impose. And the records of the patent rolls and fine rolls document these practices with a specificity that makes any apologetic account of John's government difficult to sustain. The sexual scandals of John's reign, which were not insignificant, and which included the seduction or coercion of the wives and daughters of his barons, a practice documented in several chronicle sources and supported by the circumstantial evidence of payments recorded on the rolls that appear to represent compensation for exactly such offences, added a dimension of personal violation to the political grievances of the baronial class that transformed what might otherwise have been manageable political conflicts into something far more visceral and intractable. Matthew Paris, writing at St. Albans in the mid-13th century with the benefit of retrospect and access to oral traditions that earlier chroniclers had not preserved, describes John's sexual conduct toward the wives of his great men with a directness that later historians have sometimes dismissed as St. Albans' known hostility to the Angevin dynasty, but which is consistent enough with the pattern of behaviour documented in other sources to deserve credibility. The specific accusation that John pursued the wife of Eustace de Vesci, one of the leading baronial conspirators of the Magna Carta revolt, is corroborated by the particular intensity of de Vesci's opposition to the king and by his presence among the earliest and most committed of the rebel barons. And while the causal connection between personal grievance and political rebellion can never be established with mathematical certainty in cases like this, the pattern is sufficiently consistent across multiple instances to suggest that John's sexual behaviour was a genuine political factor in the collapse of his relationship with the baronial class. Magna Carta, sealed at Runnymede on the 15th of June, 1215, was not in its origins a document of constitutional principle in the sense that later centuries would understand, but a baronial peace treaty that sought to constrain the specific abuses of a specific king within the framework of existing feudal custom, and the fact that it became something more than that it was reissued in modified form in 1216, 1217, and 1225, that it became a touchstone of English legal culture and eventually of constitutional thought far beyond England, was not something that the barons who extorted it from John at sword point in the summer of 1215 could have foreseen or necessarily desired. What they wanted was the cessation of the particular practices that had made John's government intolerable: the arbitrary taxation, the manipulation of feudal services, the use of hostages, the corruption of justice, and the personal violations that had accumulated over 16 years of misrule. And they got from John a document that promised to address these specific grievances in specific ways, a promise that John had no intention of keeping and that he repudiated within weeks of sealing it, triggering the baronial rebellion that invited the French Prince Louis to England, and that was still militarily unresolved when John died in October of 1216, the minority of Henry III, who succeeded his father at the age of 9 and who reigned for the next 56 years, under the guidance first of the regent William Marshal, the greatest knight of the age, and subsequently through a series of advisors, favourites, and eventually his own independent judgment, produced its own distinctive scandals, which were less dramatic than those of the Johnian period, but which illuminate with particular clarity the structural tensions between royal authority and baronial expectation that would characterise the entire 13th century. Henry III's reign, which lasted from 1216 to 1272, was in many respects a period of genuine cultural and administrative achievement, during which the English common law developed with remarkable sophistication. The institutions of royal government were elaborated and regularised, and the great Gothic cathedrals and the rebuilt Westminster Abbey, which Henry lavished with a personal devotion that reflected his genuine piety, transformed the physical landscape of the kingdom. But it was also a reign in which the fundamental constitutional question of who should control royal patronage and royal appointments was contested with an intensity that produced the most comprehensive institutional crisis of the medieval English monarchy before the 14th century. The scandal of Henry III's foreign favourites, which became one of the central political issues of his reign, illuminates the particular dynamic that the combination of royal weakness and baronial ambition created in the 13th century. Henry's marriage to Eleanor of Provence in 1236 brought to England not only his queen, but a substantial connection of Savoyard relatives, the uncles and cousins of Eleanor who arrived at the English court seeking the advancement that their connection to the queen made plausible, and Henry's generous patronage of these men, who received episcopal appointments, wealthy marriages to English heiresses, and grants of royal lands and revenues, generated a hostility from the established English baronage that was both political and cultural, expressing itself in terms of national resentment at the enrichment of foreigners at English expense that anticipated by several centuries the kinds of xenophobic political rhetoric that would become common in later English history. The situation was further complicated by the arrival in England of Henry's Lusignan half-brothers, the children of his mother Isabella, of Angoulême's second marriage to Hugh de Lusignan, who were even less restrained in their demands upon royal patronage and even more provocative in their behaviour toward the English baronage, and whose presence at court created the impression of an inner circle of foreign confidants surrounding the king, who were insulated from accountability by royal favour. The provisions of Oxford of 1258, which Henry was compelled to accept under baronial military pressure in a council of reform that met in June of that year, and which established a council of 15 to oversee royal government and a system of regular parliaments to monitor. That oversight represent the most radical assault on royal prerogative between Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution, and they arose directly from the accumulated frustrations of the baronial class with Henry's patronage practices, his military disasters in France, where his attempts to recover the territories lost by John had consistently failed, and his extraordinary promise to fund a papal crusade against the Hohenstaufen ruler of Sicily, a commitment that required papal taxation of the English Church and that struck the English baronage as an unconscionable diversion of English resources to Italian political purposes. The leader of the baronial reform movement was Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, who was himself an example of the complexity of the foreign favourite phenomenon, a Frenchman by birth who had come to England, married the king's sister Eleanor, and subsequently become one of the most formidable figures in English political life. A man of genuine administrative ability and genuine principle, who also possessed a talent for controversy and a capacity for personal arrogance that made him enemies almost as readily as his abilities made him allies. Simon de Port. Montfort's career, which culminated in his leadership of the baronial government of England from 1264 to 1265, and in the Parliament of 1265 that has been retrospectively identified as one of the origins of the English parliamentary tradition, ended in the Battle of Evesham on the 4th of August, 1265, where he was surrounded and killed by the forces of Prince Edward, Henry III's son, in one of the most decisively managed military actions of the century. The treatment of de Montfort's body after the battle, which was mutilated by the royalist soldiers in a manner that contemporaries described with horror and that involved the removal of his head and his genitalia as trophies, reflects the intensity of the passions that the Civil War had generated and the particular animus of the royalist commanders toward a man who had held the king prisoner and had administered England as an independent political authority for the better part of a year. The cult of de Montfort that developed at Evesham in the years following his death, complete with reported miracles and pilgrimage, was suppressed by the crown with considerable vigour because it threatened to invest his memory with the kind of sacred authority that had followed the death of Beckett. But its persistence for several decades suggests the depth of the popular attachment to a figure who had come to represent, in the popular imagination, the cause of justice against arbitrary royal power, the reign of Edward I, who succeeded his father Henry III in 1272 after a reign that had been in practice managed by Edward himself since the defeat of de Montfort in 1265, represents a period of extraordinary governmental energy and systematic territorial expansion that generated its own distinctive scandals, less centred on personal moral catastrophe than on the systematic oppression of conquered peoples and the manipulation of legal and fiscal instruments to achieve political objectives that exceeded what the conventions of the period regarded as legitimate. Edward's conquest of Wales, which he accomplished through two campaigns in 1277 and 1282 to 1283, following the Welsh revolt led by Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, was prosecuted with a military thoroughness that involved the construction of the most comprehensive network of royal castles ever built in the British Isles, a ring of fortifications at Flint, Rhuddlan, Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech, and Beaumaris, whose cost ran to approximately £80,000 over the course of the reign, and whose purpose was the permanent military domination of a population that had been incorporated into the English crown through force and that continued to resist through armed rebellion and cultural persistence. The execution of Dafydd ap Gruffudd, the last native Prince of Wales, in October of 1283, was conducted with a deliberate savagery that went beyond the conventions of judicial execution in the period, involving hanging, drawing, and quartering, a sentence whose elaboration of suffering was intended to communicate a political message about the consequences of rebellion against English authority, and which would subsequently be applied to William Wallace of Scotland and to other rebels against Plantagenet power, with a consistency that suggests royal policy rather than judicial excess. The expulsion of the Jews from England, 1290, which Edward I decreed in July of that year, and which drove approximately 2,000 people from a community that had existed in England since the Norman conquest, and that had been subject to escalating persecution throughout the 13th century, represents one of the darkest acts of the Plantagenet period, and one that has received inadequate attention in popular accounts of medieval English history. The Jewish community of England had occupied, since the conquest, a position of structural ambivalence within English society, simultaneously protected by the Crown as a royal asset, because the Crown taxed Jewish money-lending activities with a systematic thoroughness that made Jewish financial activity a significant source of royal revenue and subjected to periodic popular violence, legal discrimination, and the theological hostility of a church that characterized Jewish existence in Christian society as a tolerated anomaly awaiting conversion. The massacres of 1290 at York, where the Jewish community of the city sought refuge in Clifford's Tower as a mob gathered outside and died there, some by suicide to avoid capture, and some in the fires that destroyed the tower, while the records of their deaths were burned by citizens anxious to eliminate the documentary evidence of what they owed, exemplify the particular violence that the combination of financial resentment, theological hostility, and royal indifference could produce. Edward's expulsion of 1290, which followed a series of legal disabilities progressively imposed upon the Jewish community throughout his reign, was preceded by a substantial payment from Parliament, which suggests that the grant of taxes was secured partly through the promise of the expulsion that the parliamentary commons and the baronage regarded as a popular and fiscally beneficial measure, and the transaction illuminates with uncomfortable clarity the cynical calculation that underlay the persecution and eventual elimination of a community that had served the financial needs of the Crown for 2 centuries before being abandoned when its utility was exhausted. The Scottish Wars of Edward I, which began with his intervention in the Scottish succession crisis following the death of the child Queen Margaret in 1290, and which continued through his 2 military campaigns against William Wallace and the 3 major campaigns against Robert Bruce that occupied the final decade of his reign, were conducted by Edward with a political and military ruthlessness that violated the conventions of feudal warfare in ways that contemporaries, including his own subjects, occasionally noted with discomfort. The sack of Berwick in March of 1296, the opening military action of the First Scottish War, in which Edward's forces killed a substantial portion of the civilian population of a prosperous trading town in an action whose duration suggests royal sanction rather than mere military excess, established the tone of a conflict that Edward prosecuted with a systematic quality that went beyond the normal objectives of medieval warfare and sought the complete subjugation of Scotland as an independent political entity. The removal of the Stone of Destiny from Scone to Westminster Abbey in 1296, which was a calculated act of symbolic despoliation intended to communicate that Scottish kingship had been permanently absorbed into the English crown, and the subsequent carrying away of the Scottish royal records, the Scottish royal regalia, and numerous other symbolic objects of Scottish sovereignty, was a political act of a particular kind, the attempt to erase not merely the military but the cultural and legal foundations of Scottish independence, and its failure as a long-term strategy was demonstrated by the persistence of Scottish resistance through the rest of Edward's reign and beyond. The reign of Edward II, which lasted from 1307 to 1327 and ended with the king's deposition and subsequent murder at Berkeley Castle, constitutes the most complete personal and political catastrophe of the Plantagenet dynasty, and one that generated scandals of extraordinary depth and complexity, touching on every dimension of medieval political life. Edward II's reign failed for reasons that were simultaneously structural and personal. Structural, in that he inherited a kingdom deeply involved in an expensive and militarily inconclusive Scottish war, with a treasury depleted by his father's campaigns, and a baronage whose expectations of royal consultation, patronage distribution had been inflated by the constitutional developments of the preceding decades, and personal in that Edward combined a near-total incapacity for the military leadership that the conventions of the period regarded as the primary duty of a medieval king, with a pattern of intimate personal favoritism toward a series of low-born companions that the baronial class experienced as simultaneously a personal affront and a practical threat to their political influence. Piers Gaveston, who had been a companion of Edward since before his accession and who was created Earl of Cornwall in August of 1307, was a Gascon knight of considerable personal ability and charm, whose relationship with Edward was characterized by contemporaries with a variety of terms that collectively suggest an emotional and physical intimacy that exceeded anything that could be contained within the conventions of medieval male friendship. And the question of whether that intimacy was sexual in the sense that the word carries in modern understanding has been debated by historians with a sophistication that acknowledges both the genuine evidence for an extraordinary degree of personal attachment and the anachronism of applying modern sexual categories to medieval relationships. What cannot be doubted is that Edward's favoritism toward Gaveston was absolute and politically devastating, that he elevated Gaveston above all other great men of the kingdom, allowed him to mock the English earls with nicknames drawn from Arthurian romance and French farce, and permitted him to accumulate a concentration of influence that the baronage found intolerable as both a political and a personal offence. Gaveston's execution by a group of earls led by the Earl of Lancaster in June of 1312, carried out at Blacklow Hill in Warwickshire after a kangaroo court that Edward himself compared to the Beckett murder in its illegality, removed the immediate source of baronial fury, but created in Edward a grief and a rage that never entirely subsided, and that shaped his subsequent political choices, with consequences that compounded the disasters of his reign. The Battle of Bannockburn in June of 1314, where Edward led the largest English army, assembled for a Scottish campaign, to one of the most comprehensive defeats in English military history, destroyed both Edward's military credibility and the financial reserves that had been assembled with great difficulty for the campaign, and established Robert Bruce's position as king of an independent Scotland with a definitiveness that Edward's father's entire effort had failed to achieve. The catastrophe of Bannockburn did not result in any serious reform of royal government or any significant change in Edward's political behaviour, because Edward was constitutionally incapable of the kind of political self-assessment that would have required him to recognise the connection between his personal style of governance and the practical disasters it produced, and he continued to distribute patronage with the same disregard for baronial expectations and the same intense personal focus on a small circle of intimates that had characterised his relationship with Gaveston. The favourites who succeeded Gaveston, preeminently Hugh Despenser the elder and Hugh Despenser the younger, who rose to dominance in the royal court from 1318 onward, and who used their position to assemble a territorial empire in the Welsh Marches, and to control access to the king with a thoroughness that made them the effective rulers of the kingdom in the early 1320s, were men of a different character from Gaveston, less personally charming and more systematically rapacious, and their accumulation of landed wealth through a combination of royal favour and what can only be described as institutionalised extortion provoked a resistance that was simultaneously baronial, popular, and eventually royal, because it was the behaviour of the Despensers that transformed Queen Isabella of France from a neglected consort into an active political opponent of the regime in which she found herself increasingly marginalised. Isabella had been married to Edward in January of 1308, at the age of 12 or 13, and the marriage had produced 4 children, which establishes that the marital relationship was not entirely neglected, but Edward's emotional and political absorption in his male favourites had left Isabella in a position of increasing isolation that was not merely personally humiliating, but politically dangerous, because the Despensers had systematically stripped her of lands, revenues, and attendance in the years after 1320, and had effectively reduced her from one of the most powerful queens in English history to a figure of severely constrained circumstances with limited political resources and limited personal liberty. Isabella's departure for France in March of 1325, nominally to conduct diplomatic negotiations with her brother Charles IV of France, and her subsequent refusal to return to England, her initiation of an adulterous relationship with Roger Mortimer, the exiled Marcher Lord who had been the leading opponent of the Despensers, and her organisation of the invasion force that landed on the Suffolk coast in September of 1326, constitute one of the most dramatic acts of queenly political agency in all of English history. The speed with which the regime of Edward II and the Despensers collapsed upon Isabella's landing reflects the depth of the accumulated resentment that both the king and his favourites had generated. Because the military resistance that Isabella encountered was negligible, the Despensers were captured and executed within weeks. Hugh Despenser, the younger's execution at Hereford on the 24th of November, 1326, involving the same elaborate ritual of disemboweling and dismemberment that had been applied to William Wallace, and Edward himself was captured, deprived of his royal dignity in a formal ceremony of abdication or forced renunciation at Kenilworth in January of 1327, and imprisoned at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire under the guardianship of men whose loyalties were to Mortimer. The murder of Edward II at Berkeley Castle in September of 1327, the exact date remaining uncertain within a range of a few days, is one of the most analysed crimes in English medieval history, partly because the circumstances of his death, which contemporaries and modern historians alike have suspected was neither natural nor accidental, were suppressed with enough official determination to ensure that the truth, whatever it was, could never be definitively established from the surviving evidence. The traditional account, which describes Edward's death as having been affected by the insertion of a red-hot poker through a horn tube inserted into his rectum, an elaboration of suffering designed to leave no external marks while causing agonizing internal injuries, appears first in chronicle sources written decades after the event, and may represent a later confabulation that combined knowledge of his actual cause of death with the desire to construct a narrative of symbolic retributive justice for his relationship with Gaveston, and the recent scholarship on Edward's death has generally been more cautious, noting that the earliest accounts simply say he died of natural causes or that he was found dead, and that the more lurid versions belong to a later tradition of chronicle elaboration. What is not in doubt is that Edward's death was convenient for Isabella and Mortimer, who had no interest in keeping alive a deposed king around whom opposition to their regime might crystallise, and that the question of responsibility for whatever happened at Berkeley in the autumn of 1327 implicates, at the highest level, the woman who had displaced her husband with such theatrical political effectiveness. The regime of Isabella and Mortimer, which governed England in the name of the young Edward III from 1327 to 1330, was itself a scandal, because it made visible what the deposition of Edward II had initially obscured, which was that the revolution of 1326 had not been a reform of royal government, but a replacement of one set of royal favourites with another, and that Roger Mortimer's accumulation of lands, titles, and influence in the 3 years of the Regency replicated with uncomfortable fidelity the patterns of excess that had characterised the Despenser period. Mortimer's creation as Earl of March in October of 1328, an entirely new earldom of vast territorial extent, and his effective control over all patronage distributions and all major political decisions, including the Treaty of Edinburgh in 1328, that recognised Scottish independence under Robert Bruce and that was deeply unpopular in England, generated among the baronage the same combination of political frustration and personal resentment that had characterized the opposition to Gaveston and the Despensers, and it was eventually Edward III himself, 18 years old in October of 1330, who organized the coup that ended the regime, seizing Mortimer at Nottingham Castle on the night of the 19th of October, having gained access to the castle through a subterranean passage that has been identified by modern archaeology, and having Mortimer executed at Tyburn on the 29th of November on charges that included the murder of Edward II, a charge that acknowledged officially for the first time that the former king had not died of natural causes. Edward III's reign, which lasted from 1330 to 1377, was in formal terms the most militarily successful and in some respects the most politically stable of the Plantagenet reigns, producing the great victories of Crécy and Poitiers, the Black Prince's extraordinary military career, the foundation of the Order of the Garter, and a cultural and institutional flowering that contemporaries celebrated with genuine enthusiasm. But even this reign contained within it the seeds of later catastrophe and produced its own distinctive scandals, most notably the extraordinary public career of Alice Perez, the royal mistress of Edward's final years, whose prominence at court and whose financial manipulation of the king's declining faculties constituted one of the more remarkable examples of female political agency in the Plantagenet period. Alice Perez had entered the royal household as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Philippa of Hainault and had become Edward's mistress by the early 1360s, apparently with the Queen's knowledge, if the evidence of her inaction is any guide, at least her acquiescence, and the relationship that developed between the aging king and his young mistress was characterized by contemporaries with a mixture of prurient fascination and genuine political alarm, because Alice was not merely a companion who enjoyed the king's affection but an active political operator who used her access to the king to secure lands, revenues, and jewels on a scale that made her one of the wealthier individuals in England by the time of Edward's death. The parliamentary scandal of 1376, which is known to historians as the Good Parliament, and which constitutes the most dramatic assertion of parliamentary power against royal favourites in the century, between the provisions of Oxford and the merciless Parliament of 1388, was directed in part specifically against Alice Perez and the Council of Royal Advisers, whose corruption the Parliament's representative Commons found intolerable. The Commons, led by their elected Speaker Peter de la Mare, in the first use of that office in English parliamentary history, impeached several of the king's closest advisers on charges of financial corruption and manipulation of royal contracts, and in an extraordinary act of confrontational audacity that no parliament had previously attempted, demanded the expulsion of Alice Perez from the king's presence, a demand that was formally conceded and then systematically violated after parliament dispersed. Alice Perez was reported by the chronicler Thomas Walsingham to have been present at Edward's deathbed in June of 1377, removing the rings from the dying king's fingers, an act that may or may not have occurred exactly as described, but that captures the essential quality of a relationship that had combined genuine affection with a systematic financial exploitation that her contemporaries found outrageous, and her later reputation has confirmed. The reign of Richard II, which lasted from 1377 to 1399, is the final act of the Plantagenet dynasty as it is strictly defined, and it contains within it a concentration of political scandal, constitutional crisis, and personal tragedy that has made it one of the most intensively studied reigns in English history and the subject of one of Shakespeare's most politically acute plays. Richard was 10 years old when he succeeded his grandfather Edward III, and the minority that followed, governed by a series of royal uncles, of whom John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, was the most powerful and the most controversial, was characterized by the same tensions between royal patronage and baronial expectation that had run through the entire Plantagenet century, with the added complication of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which confronted the young king with the most serious popular uprising of the medieval English period, and which Richard handled, in the immediate crisis, with a personal courage and tactical intelligence that temporarily silenced the critics who questioned whether a child king could manage the demands of a kingdom at war. The Peasants' Revolt itself, which was triggered by the imposition of the poll tax of 1380, a flat-rate levy that fell most heavily upon the poorest members of English society, and which drew upon a century of accumulated rural resentment about serfdom, labour obligations, and the failure of the legal system to provide the poor with the same protections it afforded the wealthy, was the greatest social scandal of the Plantagenet period, in the sense that it exposed with brutal clarity the contradictions between the ideological claims of medieval Christian social theory, which posited a society organized for the common good of all its members, and the practical reality of a system in which the labor of the majority was extracted by the minority through a combination of legal obligation and economic coercion. The march of the rebels to London in June of 1381, the burning of John of Gaunt's palace of the Savoy, the murder of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, who was dragged from the Tower and beheaded by the mob on Tower Hill, and the extraordinary confrontation at Smithfield, where the young king rode out to meet the rebel leader, Wat Tyler, who was killed by the Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth, in circumstances whose exact provocation remains disputed, constituted a week of violence whose intensity shocked contemporaries across Europe, and whose implications for the stability of English society were debated by chroniclers and moralists for decades afterward. The promises that Richard made to the rebels at Mile End and Smithfield, that serfdom would be abolished and that they would receive pardons for their actions, were revoked within days of the revolt's suppression, and the systematic punishment of the rebel leaders that followed, while restrained by comparison with what might have been expected from a government that had genuinely been threatened with overthrow, confirmed what the more politically perceptive of the rebels had anticipated, that royal promises made under duress carried no legal or moral weight, that the Crown felt itself bound to honour Richard II's personal rule, which began in earnest after the crisis of 1386 to 1388, when the Lords Appellant, a coalition of magnates led by the Duke of Gloucester, the Earl of Arundel, and the Earl of Warwick, had used the judicial machinery of the merciless Parliament to purge Richard's court of his closest favourites and advisers, was characterised by a political intelligence that expressed itself in a very particular way, not as the systematic competence of a Henry II or an Edward I, but as a combination of aesthetic refinement, an interest in the arts of governance and of self-presentation that produced an extraordinary court culture at Westminster, with a genuine political cunning that Richard used to wait, with remarkable patience, for the opportunity to revenge the humiliations of the appellant's crisis. The revenge, when it came in 1397, was systematic and savage: the arrest of Gloucester, Arundel, and Warwick, the judicial murder of Gloucester in Calais before he could be formally tried, the execution of Arundel, and the exile of Warwick, constituted an act of calculated vengeance that was politically effective in the short term and catastrophically miscalculated in the long term, because it demonstrated to the entire baronial class that Richard regarded the rule of law as an instrument of royal convenience rather than as a genuine constraint upon royal action, which was precisely the claim that the appellants had made about him in 1386. The deposition of Richard II by Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster, in September of 1399, was the final, and in some ways, the most consequential scandal of the Plantagenet period, because it established, more definitively than any previous act of baronial resistance, that kingship in England was not an absolute divine institution, but a conditional office that the great men of the kingdom were capable of withdrawing from an individual who had, in their judgment, forfeited the right to exercise it. Henry Bolingbroke had been exiled by Richard in 1398, following a dispute with Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, and had been denied his Lancastrian inheritance when his father, John of Gaunt, died in February of 1399, a flagrant violation of the feudal conventions that guaranteed the right of inheritance to the legitimate heirs of a deceased tenant-in-chief, and an act that converted the entire Lancastrian affinity from passive resentment into active opposition. Bolingbroke's landing on the Yorkshire coast in late June of 1399, while Richard was campaigning in Ireland, the rapidity with which the English baronage and the royal administration defected to him, and Richard's subsequent capture, formal deposition in Parliament in September, on a list of charges that included tyranny, breach of coronation oath, and violation of the laws of the realm, and imprisonment in Pontefract Castle where he died, probably of deliberate starvation, in February of 1400, constituted the end of the Plantagenet dynasty in the direct line and the beginning of the Lancastrian period. Richard II's death at Pontefract, like Edward II's death at Berkeley 80 years earlier, was a murder committed by or on behalf of a new regime that could not afford the continuing existence of a deposed king around whom opposition might crystallize, and it followed the same pattern of official denial, chronic rumor, and ultimate historical exposure that had characterized the earlier killing, with the additional complexity that Henry IV was compelled to display Richard's body publicly at St. Paul's Cathedral in London to prevent the belief from spreading that the former king had escaped and was living in Scotland, a belief that persisted in any case for several years, and that generated at least one significant conspiracy on behalf of the pseudonymous Richard, who appeared in Scotland and was identified by some Scots as the genuine former king. The story that circulated about Richard's death, that he had been starved rather than physically killed, that he had refused food and died of grief and self-starvation, is historically plausible enough to be credible and morally convenient enough to be suspicious. But whatever the precise mechanism of his death, its political character as an act of state murder designed to secure the new dynasty is not seriously in doubt. The accumulated weight of 2.5 centuries of Plantagenet scandal, from the murder of Beckett in 1170 to the death of Richard II at Pontefract in 1400, constitutes more than a catalogue of royal crimes and moral failures, because what these events reveal when examined in their full historical context is the structural character of a political system in which the concentration of power in the person of the king, and the personal and institutional limitations on the exercise of that power, existed in permanent and productive tension. Productive because it was precisely this tension that drove the development of English law, English Parliament, English constitutional custom, and the tradition of political resistance to arbitrary royal authority that runs through Magna Carta and the provisions of Oxford and the Good Parliament, and the Deposition of Edward II and the Deposition of Richard II, and that would eventually produce, through several more centuries of conflict and reform, the constitutional settlement that would make England one of the first polities in the modern world to establish the principle of government under law rather than by the personal will of a sovereign. The scandals of the Plantagenet era were not aberrations from a system that otherwise functioned according to its stated principles, but expressions of the system itself, of the necessary and perhaps irresolvable tensions between power and obligation, between royal authority and feudal custom, between the claims of individual conscience and the demands of political loyalty, tensions that the Plantagenet kings experienced with a particular intensity because they presided over a kingdom that was simultaneously more sophisticated in its legal and administrative culture than any other realm in the medieval West, and more riven by the fundamental contradictions of a system in which absolute power was claimed but could never quite be exercised. The darkness of the Plantagenet era, the murders and the betrayals and the systematic oppression and the corruption of justice, was real and consequential, and ought not to be softened by the retrospective glow of historical significance, because to the men and women who experienced it, the archbishop whose skull was split open on the cathedral pavement, the Welsh lord whose body was carved for political demonstration, the Jewish families, driven from the only country they had ever known, the peasants whose labour was extorted and whose uprising was suppressed, and whose leaders were executed for the crime of demanding that the law mean what it said. The darkness was not metaphorical but immediate and physical, and without the consolation of historical meaning. What history adds, what the long perspective that separates the 21st century from the 12th provides, is not justification but comprehension. The ability to see how the specific crimes and moral catastrophes of the Plantagenet period were embedded in structures that transcended individual wickedness, how they arose from conditions that were themselves the products of longer historical processes, and how they left traces in the legal, political, and cultural inheritance of the societies that came after them, traces that are still visible in the institutions of English governance and in the traditions of political thought that those institutions generated. The Plantagenet kings were not simply villains, though some of them performed villainous acts, nor were they simply heroes, though some of them performed acts of genuine courage and administrative genius, but something more complicated and more interesting than either. Human beings exercising extraordinary power in extraordinarily constrained circumstances, generating in the collision between their ambitions and their limitations a history that was dark and brilliant and consequential in equal measure, and that has continued to compel the attention of every generation that has looked back upon it since the last of the Plantagenet line died in the cold of a Yorkshire castle in the first year of the 15th century. The long shadow of Plantagenet scandal fell across not only the immediate reigns in which these events occurred, but across the entire subsequent history of English monarchy, because each generation of kings and queens who followed them had to govern in the consciousness of what the Plantagenet experience had demonstrated about the limits and the dangers of royal power. Henry IV, who had been the architect of Richard II's deposition, spent his reign haunted by the legitimacy problem that the deposition had created, because in removing Richard from the throne, he had established the precedent that a king could be removed, and this precedent would contribute directly to the Wars of the Roses that consumed the 15th century and that ultimately brought the Plantagenet dynasty in all its collateral lines to its final violent end. Henry V, whose brilliant military career at Agincourt and in the subsequent conquest of Normandy briefly revived the Plantagenet tradition of aggressive military kingship, died young in 1422, leaving an infant heir whose minority became the occasion for the exact same conflicts between baronial faction and royal minority government that had characterized the minorities of Henry III and Richard II, and the catastrophic reign of Henry VI that followed, marked by military disaster in France, financial collapse, personal mental illness that rendered the king periodically incapable of any governance at all, and ultimately by the dynastic conflict that is known to history as the Wars of the Roses, represents the final catastrophic expression of all the structural tensions that the Plantagenet period had generated and failed to resolve. The memory of the Plantagenet kings was itself a subject of political controversy throughout the later medieval and early modern periods, because different political actors with different interests had different reasons to construct different narratives about what the Plantagenet inheritance meant and what lessons it offered for their own present circumstances. The cult of Simon de Montfort, which the crown suppressed but could not entirely eliminate, the veneration of Thomas Beckett, which Henry VIII would eventually destroy along with the shrine itself, the invocations of Magna Carta by parliamentary opponents of Stuart royal prerogative in the 17th century, all represent the ongoing process by which the Plantagenet past was continuously reimagined and redeployed in the service of present political arguments, a process that is itself testimony to the extraordinary richness and complexity of the historical deposit that the Plantagenet period left behind. The specific historical events, the murder at Canterbury, the rebellion of the Queen, the corruption of the Johnnian court, the judicial murder of Gaveston, the deposition of kings, retain their power to compel and disturb not because they are simply shocking, though they are that, but because they raise questions about power and justice and loyalty and conscience that are not resolved by their own historical context and that continue to resonate in any political order where the same tensions exist in different forms, which is to say in every political order that human beings have ever constructed or are likely to construct, because the problem of how power is to be exercised and constrained, how the claims of individual conscience are to be weighed against the demands of institutional loyalty, and how a society is to hold its most powerful members to the standards it professes to revere, are not problems that any historical period has resolved, but problems that each generation inherits from the last and transmits, somewhat imperfectly addressed, to the next. The scandal of royal finance during the Plantagenet period extended far beyond the personal corruption of individual officials or the fiscal desperation of individual kings, because it was embedded in the foundational structures of a political economy in which the distinction between the king's public revenues and his private household income was neither clearly drawn nor consistently observed, and in which the extraction of wealth from the kingdom's population was mediated through a network of obligations, customs, and informal arrangements that created permanent opportunities for manipulation and abuse at every level of the administrative hierarchy. The tollage, which was the king's right to levy arbitrary taxes upon the royal demesne lands and the towns that were considered royal property, was an instrument of fiscal extraction that bore with particular weight upon the urban populations of England in the 12th and 13th centuries, and the frequency with which tollage was imposed, the irregularity of the assessments, and the absence of any effective mechanism for challenging either the imposition or the level of the levy, created a fiscal relationship between the Crown and the commercially productive populations of England that was characterized by a chronic mutual suspicion and a periodic explosive resentment that the good Parliament of 1376 and the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 would eventually, and in very different ways, express. The forest laws, which designated large portions of the English countryside as royal forest, subject to a separate jurisdiction whose primary purpose was the protection of royal hunting and which imposed severe penalties, including mutilation, and in the earlier Plantagenet period death, upon those who hunted the king's deer or cleared royal forest for cultivation, were another dimension of the fiscal and legal apparatus through which royal power was experienced by ordinary English people as arbitrary, oppressive, and disconnected from any recognizable principle of justice. Henry II's Assize of Woodstock of 1184, which regularized and in some respects intensified the forest law, was one of the most consistently unpopular acts of his reign, and one that generated grievances that survived long enough to appear in the Forest Charter of 1217, the companion document to Magna Carta that addressed the specific abuses of the forest administration. The tournament, which was the dominant form of martial entertainment among the aristocratic classes of England throughout the Plantagenet period, was also, less visibly, one of the principal arenas of financial manipulation and political networking, and its scandals, which were numerous and sometimes fatal, illuminate the specific culture of organized violence that characterized the military aristocracy and that regularly produced consequences beyond the controlled conditions that the institution nominally imposed. Henry II had banned tournaments in England, not from any squeamishness about the violence involved, but because he regarded them as opportunities for the baronage to organize politically outside royal supervision, and as threats to public order in the localities where they were held, and the ban was maintained by subsequent kings with varying degrees of effectiveness until the reign of Edward I, who regulated rather than prohibited them, and who drew political and fiscal benefit from the organization of royal tournaments that served simultaneously as military training, political theatre, and venues for the demonstration of royal magnificence. The deaths that tournaments regularly produced, including the death of Henry II's son, Geoffrey, at a Paris tournament in 1186, were accepted by the participants as an occupational hazard of a profession in which violence was the primary medium of social distinction. But the tournament's capacity for generating scandal extended beyond the physical dangers of the combat itself to include the financial ruination of knights who lost their horses and equipment in tournament combat and were compelled to ransom them back at prices they could not afford. The social humiliations that tournament defeat imposed in a culture where martial prowess was the primary measure of masculine worth, and the opportunities for the organization of political conspiracies that large gatherings of armed men, temporarily removed from the scrutiny of royal administration, regularly provided. The relationship between the Plantagenet kings and the papacy, which was the most powerful transnational institution of the medieval period, and which regarded itself as exercising a sovereignty over Christian Europe that superseded and encompassed the authority of individual secular rulers, was a permanent source of potential scandal in the sense that every assertion of royal authority over ecclesiastical affairs, from the appointment of bishops to the taxation of the clergy to the trial of criminal clerics, was simultaneously an assertion of a claim that the papacy contested and a potential trigger for the kind of conflict that had produced the Beckett crisis. The relationship between John and Innocent III, which produced the interdict of 1208, by which England was placed under a general suspension of the sacraments and the ceremonies of Christian life for 6 years, was the most severe and sustained crisis in the crown-papacy relationship between the Beckett period and the Reformation, arising initially from the disputed election to the Archbishopric of Canterbury in 1206, in which John sought to impose his own candidate against both the cathedral chapter's preference and the papal will, and escalating through John's refusal to accept Stephen Langton, the Pope's candidate, into a general conflict that involved the sequestration of church property, the exile of the English clergy, and eventually John's excommunication in 1209, the resolution of the conflict in 1213, by which John surrendered England as a papal fief and became in theory a vassal of Innocent, was presented by John's opponents as the most humiliating capitulation in the history of the English monarchy, and by John's apologists as a shrewd diplomatic maneuver that secured papal support for his position against the barons, and the truth, as with most of John's political calculations, lies somewhere between these poles and involves a degree of strategic intelligence applied to a situation that his own earlier intransigence had largely created. The persecution of the Templars in England in 1308-1309, which followed the suppression of the order in France by Philip IV with the cooperation of Pope Clement V, constitutes one of the most complex and morally ambiguous episodes of the later Plantagenet period, and one that illustrates the extent to which English policy in this period was shaped by continental pressures that the English crown, not always in a position to resist. The Knights Templar, who had been founded in Jerusalem in 1119 as a military religious order dedicated to the protection of Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, and who had grown over the subsequent 2 centuries into the most powerful international financial institution of the medieval world, maintaining a network of houses, banking operations, and military resources that spanned from the British Isles to the Levant, had accumulated in England a substantial landed endowment and a role in royal finance that made their relationship with the English crown one of mutual dependency rather than simple subordination. The charges that Philip IV and his advisers had constructed against the Templars, alleging the practice of heretical rites, including the denial of Christ, obscene rituals of initiation, and the worship of a demonic idol called Baphomet, were almost certainly fabricated, as the scholarly consensus of the 21st century has concluded, and were motivated primarily by Philip's desire to seize the Templar wealth in France and to eliminate an institution whose international financial power represented a potential check upon royal fiscal sovereignty. Edward II's initial reluctance to proceed against the Templars in England, his obvious skepticism about the charges, and his eventual acquiescence in the suppression following sustained papal pressure, illustrate the constraints under which even a king who was not notably successful in resisting pressure could be compelled to participate in what he appears to have recognized as an institutional injustice, because the political cost of maintaining solidarity with an order that the papacy had condemned was simply too high for a king whose position was already compromised by domestic baronial opposition and military failure in the Senate. Scotland. The judicial torture applied to the English Templars in an attempt to extract confessions, which was authorized by papal mandate and which represented an intrusion of continental legal practice into an English system that had traditionally regarded torture as incompatible with the procedures of common law, produced under duress a series of admissions that were subsequently used to justify the dissolution of the order in England and the redistribution of Templar lands, primarily to the Hospitallers, the rival military order, and to lay landowners who were able to acquire Templar properties at favourable prices in the chaos of the suppression. The scandal of the Templar persecution lay not merely in the likely innocence of the individual knights who were subjected to torture and imprisonment, though that was scandal enough, but in the demonstration that the institutional framework of English justice, which had been developing throughout the Plantagenet period with a sophistication and a commitment to procedural regularity that distinguished it from most continental legal systems, was vulnerable to override by a sufficient combination of papal authority and royal political weakness, and that the protections it offered were available only to those who were not targeted by a power capable of suspending the normal rules. The Black Death, which reached England in the summer of 1348 and killed between a third and a half of the total population of the country in the initial epidemic, with subsequent recurrences in 1361, 1369, and 1375, maintaining the demographic pressure for the remainder of the century, did not produce scandals of the kind that characterized the political and personal catastrophes of the earlier Plantagenet period, but it generated a crisis of moral legitimacy that was at least as profound in its long-term social consequences, because the failure of the Church, whose clergy died in proportions similar to or greater than the general population, to provide adequate spiritual comfort or to explain the pestilence in terms that the traditional theological framework could convincingly sustain, and the failure of the secular authorities to take any effective action to limit the spread or the mortality of the disease, exposed with unprecedented clarity the limits of the institutional frameworks within which medieval society had organized itself. The flagellant movements that spread through continental Europe in response to the plague, though less prominent in England than in France and the German lands, the attacks upon Jewish communities that occurred in many continental cities based on accusations of deliberate poisoning of wells, accusations that Edward III's government did not endorse, but that it also did not effectively prevent in the localities where English Jews still remained, and the wave of popular religious enthusiasm and heterodox spiritual seeking that the pestilence generated, all represented forms of social and theological crisis that the institutions of Plantagenet governance were entirely unable to address, and that left lasting marks on English, religious, and social culture. The heresy of John Wycliffe and the Lollard movement that his teaching generated in the later decades of the 14th century was, among other things, a consequence of the Black Death's destabilization of orthodox religious culture, and it constitutes one of the most intellectually significant scandals of the Plantagenet period, because it introduced into English religious life a challenge to the doctrinal and institutional authority of the Church that was not merely the heterodox speculation of an individual theologian, but a popular movement with a broad social base that included both university intellectuals and members of the artisan and merchant classes who had the literacy to engage with vernacular religious texts. Wycliffe, who was an Oxford theologian of considerable ability, who had in the early part of his career been a defender of royal rights against papal fiscal claims, developed in the 1370s and 1380s a theology that challenged the doctrine of transubstantiation, questioned the need for a sacerdotal priesthood as a mediator between the individual and God, attacked the wealth and corruption of the institutional church with a directness that drew upon the same tradition of clerical satire that had characterized English literary culture since at least the 12th century, and asserted the authority of Scripture over tradition and ecclesiastical decree in terms that anticipated by more than a century the positions that Luther and Calvin would take in the Reformation. The Lollard movement that grew from Wycliffe's teaching survived his death in 1384 and the condemnation of his views by the Church, persisting through the remainder of the Plantagenet period and through the Lancastrian and Yorkist dynasties that followed, sustaining a tradition of vernacular religious reading, anti-clerical critique, and scriptural authority that would eventually merge with the Continental Reformation to produce the English Protestant Church of the 16th century, and in doing so, it represents one of the most significant legacies of the Plantagenet era, a scandal that became a revolution across the span of 2 centuries. The specific patterns of land, seizure, and inheritance manipulation that characterized the later Plantagenet period, as the Crown found itself in chronic fiscal difficulty and resorted with increasing frequency to the exploitation of its feudal prerogatives as a revenue-generating mechanism, created a culture of legal insecurity around landed property that was itself a form of ongoing scandal, because it violated the fundamental principle that feudal law was supposed to guarantee the certainty of hereditary succession to those who fulfilled their feudal obligations. The practice of using the legal machinery of treason proceedings to seize the estates of political opponents had been employed by various Plantagenet kings, but Edward II's seizure of the Lancastrian inheritance in 1322 after the execution of the Earl of Lancaster, and Richard II's seizure of the same inheritance in 1399 after the death of John of Gaunt and the exile of Bolingbroke. Both represent uses of the treason law for purposes that went beyond the legitimate punishment of treasonous acts, and that were experienced by the baronial class as attacks upon the security of hereditary property rights that the entire feudal system was supposed to protect. It was Richard's seizure of the Lancastrian inheritance that most immediately triggered Bolingbroke's return and the eventual deposition of Richard himself. And the irony of this sequence, that the king's attempt to use the legal machinery of the state to secure fiscal advantage destroyed the very royal authority that made such manipulation possible, illustrates with particular clarity the characteristic pattern of Plantagenet overreach, the consistent tendency of these kings to push their authority beyond the limits that their subjects could tolerate without resistance, and to generate in that resistance consequences that exceeded anything that the initial transgression could have justified. The treatment of prisoners and hostages in the Plantagenet period, which was governed by conventions that recognized the right of a captive knight or lord to fair treatment in exchange for ransom, and the right of a hostage to safety, so long as the obligation he guaranteed was honored, was violated with sufficient frequency by the Plantagenet kings and their officials to constitute a systematic, rather than merely occasional breach of the rules of chivalric conduct. John's treatment of the prisoners taken at Mirabeau in 1202, the majority of whom were starved to death or died of mistreatment in the royal prisons, rather than being ransomed in the conventional manner, was sufficiently shocking to be noted by multiple chronicle sources, and was directly responsible for the defection of the Norman and Breton baronage that led to the loss of Normandy. The treatment of Welsh and Scottish prisoners by Edward I, the execution of Llywelyn ap Grufford's brother Dafydd in 1283 and of William Wallace in 1305, with the elaborate ritual of public dismemberment that was supposed to communicate the severity of treason against the English crown, was conducted in the full knowledge that these men were being treated as criminals within a legal framework that they had never accepted, and under a sovereignty that they had spent their lives resisting, and the use of spectacular judicial violence as a political communication was understood perfectly well by the populations at which it was directed, as the persistence of Welsh and Scottish resistance through the subsequent decades amply demonstrates. The role of women in Plantagenet scandal extends beyond the obvious cases of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Isabella of France to encompass a broader pattern of female agency and female vulnerability within a political system that formally excluded women from the exercise of public power, while making them instrumentally necessary to its operation. The heiresses whose marriages were disposed of by the crown as instruments of political alliance and patronage distribution, the queens whose reproductive function was their primary political obligation, and whose political intelligence was simultaneously needed and distrusted, the mistresses whose relationship with the king gave them influence they were not supposed to possess and security they rarely achieved, the widows whose inherited lands made them objects of forced remarriage and whose legal rights were in theory protected by Magna Carta and in practice frequently violated, all inhabited a political world in which their agency was constrained by legal and cultural frameworks they had not designed and could not fundamentally alter. The scandalous quality of the female experience in Plantagenet England arises not primarily from individual acts of mistreatment, though these were numerous and sometimes extreme, but from the structural conditions that made such mistreatment possible, and in many cases unremarkable, the absence of legal personhood that made married women legally invisible within their husbands' identities, the conventions that restricted the public expression of female intelligence and ambition to the narrow channels of religious devotion and courtly culture, and the permanent vulnerability that women's physical and economic dependence upon men created in a society where the legal machinery for the protection of that dependence was both imperfect and inconsistently applied. The cultural productions of the Plantagenet court, the chronicles that recorded the events of the reigns, the legal texts that codified the developing common law, the literary works that circulated in the aristocratic and increasingly the urban literate culture of the period, were themselves participants in the construction and the management of scandal because they determined what was recorded, how it was framed, who was implicated, and what kinds of behavior were presented as outrageous, and what kinds were normalized by the silence that surrounds them in the documentary record. The monastic chroniclers who provide the most detailed accounts of Plantagenet political life, men like Roger of Hoveden and Ralph of Diceto in the 12th century, Roger of Wendover and Matthew Paris in the 13th, and Thomas Walsingham in the 14th, wrote from institutional positions that shaped their perspectives in ways that were not always transparent to their contemporaries and that require careful interpretation by historians, because the monasteries in which they wrote had their own relationships with the crown, their own feudal obligations, their own patronage networks, and their own ideological commitments that influenced what they chose to record and how they chose to present it. Matthew Paris, who wrote at St. Albans in the mid-13th century and who provides some of the most vivid and detailed accounts of Henry III's reign, was himself embedded in a tradition of St. Albans historiography that had consistently been critical of the Angevin and Plantagenet kings, and that reflected the specific perspective of a wealthy monastic house whose relationship with crown was frequently contentious, and his accounts of royal corruption and baronial resistance, while enormously valuable as historical sources, need to be read with an awareness of the institutional interests that shaped his perspective. The legal records that have survived from the Plantagenet period, the pipe rolls and the patent rolls and the close rolls and the records of the various royal courts, provide a different and in some ways more reliable window into the scandals of the era because they document in administrative rather than narrative form the financial manipulations, the property disputes, the criminal proceedings, and the political transactions that the chronicles describe in more emotionally charged terms, and they do so with a specificity of detail that allows modern historians to test the chronicles' claims against the documentary evidence. The discrepancy between what the chronicles say and what the legal records show is itself illuminating, because it reveals the gap between the narrative understanding that contemporaries constructed about their political world and the administrative reality that the records preserve, and this gap is often the place where the most interesting historical questions reside. The Plantagenet period is one of the best documented eras of medieval English history precisely because of the extraordinary richness and continuity of the administrative record that the Angevin legal reforms generated from the mid-12th century onward, and it is this richness of documentation that makes the scandals of the period so recoverable and so detailed, not because those who governed England in this period were more corrupt or more violent than their counterparts in other times and places, but because they governed in a period that was developing, with remarkable speed and sophistication, the administrative and legal infrastructure through which such behaviour was recorded, challenged, and occasionally punished. The legacy of the Plantagenet scandals in the history of English political culture is a complex one, because they contributed to the development of precisely the institutional mechanisms that were supposed to prevent their recurrence, and they did so through a process of political learning that was painful, incremental, and never complete. Magna Carta did not prevent the abuses that it prescribed from recurring in the subsequent centuries, but it created a documentary standard against which those abuses could be measured, and a rhetorical resource that could be deployed in the argument for their correction. The parliamentary institutions that developed through the 13th and 14th centuries, driven in part by the fiscal needs of the crown and in part by the baronial, and eventually the common people's desire for a voice in the governance of the kingdom, created an institutional framework within which political conflict could be managed, if not resolved, through deliberation rather than through the purely military terms in which the great rebellions of the Plantagenet period had ultimately been decided. The common law, whose development through the Plantagenet period represents one of the most remarkable institutional achievements of the medieval world, provided a system of legal remedies whose existence, even when it was imperfectly enforced, established the principle that the crown was subject to law rather than simply the source of it, and that ordinary subjects had claims upon the justice of the realm that the crown was in theory obligated to honour. These institutional achievements were inseparable from the scandals that had driven their creation, because it was precisely the experience of royal tyranny, judicial corruption, fiscal extortion, and the murder of those who opposed royal excess that created the political will to construct the mechanisms of accountability that the Plantagenet period bequeathed to its successors. The enduring fascination that the Plantagenet era exerts upon the historical imagination of the English-speaking world reflects something real about the character of this period, which is that it combined, in a concentration rarely achieved in any era of comparable length, the most dramatic exercises of personal power with the most consequential developments in political institutions, and that it did so in a context where the sources are rich enough and the personalities sufficiently vivid to make the connection between individual human action and large-scale historical development unusually traceable. The murder at Canterbury and the founding of constitutional government, the deposition of Edward II and the development of parliamentary sovereignty, the corruption of John's court and the creation of Magna Carta, the persecution of the Jews and the expulsion that followed, the Black Death and the crisis of religious authority that preceded the Reformation. These are not separate stories but interconnected expressions of a single complex historical process. The transformation of medieval England from a kingdom governed by the personal will of a warrior king, supported by a military aristocracy, into a polity in which the exercise of power was, increasingly and imperfectly, subject to institutional constraint and public accountability. That transformation was not a smooth or inevitable progress but a jagged, contested, frequently violent process that produced as many disasters as achievements, and the scandals of the Plantagenet period were not merely the dark backdrop against which this progress occurred, but the actual substance of the conflict through which it was fought out, generation by generation. In the courts and the councils and the battlefields and the prisons and the cathedrals of medieval England, the question of dynastic legitimacy, which was the central anxiety of the Plantagenet period, and which generated more political violence, more judicial murder, and more constitutional innovation than any other single issue, was also the question that the dynasty ultimately failed to resolve because the solution that Henry II had sought to impose, the hereditary transmission of an undivided royal authority supported by a sophisticated administrative apparatus, proved in practice incompatible with the realities of human biology, the contingency of individual royal character, and the structural demands of the feudal system within which English kingship operated. The production of legitimate male heirs, which was the biological precondition of dynastic continuity, was subject to all the unpredictability of medieval reproductive life, where infant mortality was high, where queens might die in childbirth or prove permanently infertile, and where the king himself might die before his sons had reached an age at which they could exercise independent authority, and the minors who succeeded their fathers were systematically vulnerable to the predations of the baronial class in ways that adult kings, however incompetent, were not. Henry III succeeded at 9, Edward III at 14, Richard II at 10, and each of these minorities produced its own distinctive set of crises, because the institutional mechanisms for managing royal minorities, the regency councils and the great councils and the increasingly formalized parliaments, were neither sufficiently robust nor sufficiently consensual to prevent the conflicts over access to royal patronage and royal favor that the absence of a governing adult king inevitably generated. The particular scandal of royal succession in the Plantagenet period was that the rules governing it were simultaneously clear in principle and deeply contested in practice, because the principle of primogeniture, the inheritance of the throne by the eldest legitimate male heir, was well established as a general norm, but was sufficiently flexible in its application to generate genuine disputes in specific circumstances, and these disputes were exploited with systematic ruthlessness by every claimant who had the military resources to make his case by force. The succession dispute of 1135 to 1154, which is known to historians as the Anarchy, and which saw the kingdom torn between the supporters of King Stephen and the supporters of the Empress, Matilda, Henry II's mother, was formally the prequel to the Plantagenet period rather than a part of it, but it shaped the Plantagenet monarchy in fundamental ways, because Henry II came to power in the aftermath of 19 years of civil war that had devastated the administrative infrastructure of the kingdom and had demonstrated with terrible clarity What happened to English society when the succession was disputed and the great lords of the kingdom were free to pursue their own interests without effective royal governance? The determination that drove Henry's legal reforms and his fiscal reorganization reflected the experience of the anarchy as formative trauma, and the extraordinary energy that he devoted to the reconstruction of royal authority in the early years of his reign was the energy of a man who had grown up in the shadow of his mother's failed bid for the throne, and who was resolved that nothing similar would happen in his own dynastic arrangements. The arrangements that Henry made for the succession were themselves, however, a source of the very conflicts they were intended to prevent, because the coronation of the young King Henry as junior king in 1170, which was intended to secure the succession by establishing the heir in an unambiguous formal position, simultaneously created a second royal figure whose authority was nominal but whose expectations were real, and this contradiction, which had been recognized as dangerous by contemporaries who noted the precedents from continental dynastic practice, generated precisely the rebellion that it was supposed to prevent. The young king's resentment was not merely personal, not simply the frustration of an ambitious young man chafing against a dominant father, but had a structural character that arose from the impossibility of the position he had been placed in, because he had been given a title that implied authority, and a status that commanded deference without the territorial revenue or administrative power that would have given that authority and deference any practical content. And the barons and knights who attached themselves to his household had done so in the expectation of access to patronage that he could not provide because he had no land from which to distribute it, which meant that his household was simultaneously a court without real power and a focus for the ambitions of men who needed a patron in a position to reward them. The dynastic complications of Richard I's reign, which included the king's failure to produce legitimate heirs and the consequent uncertainty about the succession that this failure generated, illuminate a different dimension of the Plantagenet succession problem. Richard's marriage to Berenguela of Navarre, which Eleanor of Aquitaine had organized in 1190 in the conviction that Richard needed a queen whose political connections would be useful in the diplomacy of the Third Crusade, produced no surviving children, and the question of whether this failure of issue was the result of Richard's absence on crusade and subsequently in captivity, the gynecological misfortunes that were common enough in the period, or the somewhat more vexed question of Richard's sexual inclinations, which contemporaries occasionally addressed in terms that are suggestive of an attraction to men rather than women without being sufficiently explicit to constitute definitive evidence, was a matter of political significance because of its implications for the succession. The political crisis that Richard's death from the crossbow wound at Chalus-Chabrol in April of 1199 created, specifically the competing claims of his nephew Arthur of Brittany, the son of his elder brother Geoffrey and his brother John, illustrated the extent to which the lack of a clear, legitimate heir could transform what might have been a straightforward succession into a military conflict with devastating territorial consequences, as the loss of Normandy in 1204, which was directly connected to the baronial opposition that John's treatment of Arthur generated, would ultimately demonstrate. The financial scandals of the Plantagenet era reached their most systematic expression in the reign of Edward I, not because Edward was more personally corrupt than his predecessors, but because he was a more able administrator who pursued the exploitation of every available fiscal instrument with a thoroughness and a legal sophistication that exceeded anything his predecessors had attempted, and because the combination of the Welsh conquest, the Scottish wars, and the military ambitions in France that characterized his reign created fiscal pressures that pushed the boundaries of what the kingdom could bear. The tollage of 1297, which Edward imposed without the consent of the Parliament that had become by that point an established part of the fiscal consultation process, triggered a baronial resistance led by the Earls of Hereford and Norfolk that produced the confirmation of the charters, in which Edward was compelled to confirm Magna Carta and the Forest Charter, and to concede the principle that no tollage or aid should be levied without the common consent of the realm, a concession that represented a significant limitation on the fiscal prerogatives that he had been attempting to exercise without restraint. The confirmation of 1297 stands alongside Magna Carta as one of the foundational documents of English constitutional history. And like Magna Carta, it arose directly from royal fiscal overreach that had pushed the baronage beyond the limits of their tolerance and forced a confrontation that the king was in no position to resist because his military resources were committed elsewhere. The scandal of judicial corruption in the later Plantagenet period took on a new and particularly concerning dimension, with the development of what historians have called maintenance and livery, the practice by which powerful magnates retained lawyers, officials, and local men of influence through the payment of fees and the grant of livery, the distinctive clothing that identified a man as a member of a great lord's affinity, and used these networks to influence the operation of local justice in their favour and against their neighbours and tenants. The common law courts that Henry II had established and that had developed throughout the 12th and 13th centuries into a sophisticated system of royal justice were, in practice, vulnerable to corruption by men powerful enough to intimidate juries, suborn witnesses, and retain the most able legal practitioners for their own causes. And the development of maintenance and livery in the later 13th and 14th centuries transformed this individual vulnerability into a systematic problem because it created within the legal system a parallel structure of power and intimidation that the official machinery of justice was frequently too weak to overcome. The complaints about maintenance and livery appear in parliamentary petitions from the reign of Edward I onward, and the legislation that Parliament repeatedly enacted in an attempt to control these practices, without notable effect, is itself testimony to the depth and persistence of the problem, and to the fundamental difficulty of reforming a legal system that was embedded in a social structure whose power dynamics it was supposed to regulate. The relationship between the Plantagenet kings and the urban populations of their kingdom, which has received less attention in the popular historiography of the period than the relationship between the crown and the baronage or the crown and the church, was itself a source of scandal in ways that illuminate the class dynamics of medieval English society with particular clarity. The towns of Plantagenet England, which were growing in size, wealth, and commercial sophistication throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, occupied an ambiguous position in the feudal system that simultaneously made them valuable to the crown as sources of revenue and legal as objects of arbitrary fiscal exploitation. The charters through which towns purchased their rights of self-government, including the right to elect their own mayors and officials, to hold their own courts, and to regulate their own markets, were not grants of permanent and irrevocable freedom, but documents whose terms the crown could always modify or revoke, and the relationship between the crown and the urban communities was therefore always one of contingent negotiation rather than guaranteed security. The tollage that the crown imposed on towns without their consent was experienced by urban communities as an arbitrary violation of the commercial security that trade required, and the persistent demands for contribution to royal military campaigns, through taxation, through loans, and through the provision of military equipment, created a fiscal relationship between the crown and the merchant communities of England that was marked by chronic mutual suspicion and periodic open conflict. The scandal of the debasement of the coinage, which occurred in the reign of Henry III, and which was one of the most serious economic frauds that any medieval king could perpetrate upon his subjects, involved the reduction of the silver content of the English penny, which was the fundamental unit of the monetary economy, in a way that enriched the crown at the expense of everyone who held silver coin, because the reduction in the intrinsic value of the coin meant that the crown captured the difference between the old and new silver content as a form of implicit taxation that required no parliamentary consent and generated no formal record of the exaction. The reform of the coinage under Edward I in 1279, which re-established the silver content of the penny at a higher level and introduced the groat, a fourpenny piece, as a larger denomination for commercial transactions, was one of the most significant practical achievements of his reign, and one that had real consequences for the commercial economy, because the reliability of the coinage was a precondition for the kind of long-distance trade and credit operations that were becoming increasingly important to the English economy in the late 13th century. The practice of purveyance, which was the Crown's right to commandeer goods and services for the royal household and for military campaigns at prices assessed by royal officials rather than at the market rates that sellers could obtain from voluntary customers, was another dimension of the fiscal relationship between the Crown and its subjects that was experienced as arbitrary, oppressive, and systematically corrupt. Because the officials who assessed prices had strong incentives to set them below market levels, the process of obtaining payment, even at the assessed prices, was slow and uncertain, and the whole system was vulnerable to manipulation by purveyors who took more than they needed and kept the surplus for their own benefit. The complaints about purveyance appear in the same parliamentary petitions that document the grievances about maintenance and livery and about the abuses of the forest law, and they are complaints not about exotic or extreme practices, but about the routine operation of the royal fiscal machinery, which is precisely what makes them significant, because they reveal that the scandal of Plantagenet governance was not primarily the spectacular individual act of tyranny or murder, but the daily reality of a system of power that extracted wealth from the majority of the population, through mechanisms that were formally legal and practically inescapable. The monasteries and religious houses of England, which had been among the principal beneficiaries of the Norman and early Angevin settlement, and which had accumulated by the 13th century an extraordinary concentration of landed wealth, were themselves participants in, and sometimes victims, of the financial scandals of the Plantagenet period, because their wealth made them targets for royal fiscal pressure, for baronial encroachment, and for the internal corruption that the management of large and complex institutions with inadequate institutional accountability regularly generates. The visitation records of medieval English dioceses, which document the inquiries that bishops conducted into the spiritual and administrative state of the religious houses under their supervision, reveal a pattern of problems that includes financial mismanagement, inappropriate personal relationships between religious and lay persons, violations of the rule of enclosure, and the accumulation of personal property by monks and nuns who had taken vows of poverty. And while the rhetoric of monastic scandal was in many cases exaggerated by the institutional interests of reformers and visitation authorities, the underlying reality of chronic tension between the ideals of monastic life and the practical pressures of managing wealthy institutions in a competitive social environment was genuine and recurrent. The dissolution of the alien priories, the English cells of French monasteries, by Edward III during the periods of conflict with France, was justified on the grounds that their revenues were flowing to enemy territory, but it also conveniently transferred substantial ecclesiastical property to royal control and set a precedent for royal intervention in the governance of religious houses that would become dramatically more significant 2 centuries later. The evolution of the common law through the Plantagenet period, which historians of English law have rightly identified as one of the most significant institutional developments of the medieval world, was inseparable from the scandals that both drove its development and were produced by its imperfections. The writs that Henry II's legal reformers developed as the mechanism for bringing disputes from local and feudal courts into the royal court system, the possessory assizes that established relatively rapid and cheap procedures for determining who had recent possession of land, the grand and petty jury systems that replaced the ordeal of iron and water as methods of establishing facts in criminal and civil proceedings, all represented responses to specific injustices and specific inefficiencies that the pre-reform legal system had produced, and they were designed with the practical knowledge of what could go wrong in legal proceedings that only long experience of legal practice in its worst as well as its best forms could provide. The Bracton Treatise on the Laws and Customs of England, written in the mid-13th century and attributed traditionally but probably incorrectly to a single author, represents the most comprehensive attempt of the Plantagenet period to provide a systematic theoretical account of the English common law, and it illustrates both the remarkable sophistication that the system had achieved by the mid-13th century and the persistent gap between the theoretical principles that the treatise articulated and the practical reality of legal proceedings in which wealth, influence, and intimidation remained far more powerful determinants of outcome than any formal rule of law. The cultural legacy of the Plantagenet scandals in the literary and dramatic tradition of England has been enormous and has shaped the way in which subsequent generations have understood not only the specific events of the period, but the nature of political power more generally. Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote at the court of Richard II and whose Canterbury Tales, with their sardonic portraits of corrupt ecclesiastical officials and their frank engagement with the theme of moral corruption in high places, reflected the experience of living through the political crises of the later 14th century with a sophisticated intelligence that combined satirical edge with genuine historical understanding, was the first major English literary figure to transform the scandals of his own time into art of permanent significance. The mystery plays that developed in the 14th century as the primary form of popular religious drama performed by the craft guilds of English towns on the feast of Corpus Christi, engaged with themes of divine justice and human corruption that were simultaneously theological and political, and they did so in terms that resonated with popular experiences of the arbitrary power of landlords, corrupt officials, and royal purveyors in ways that the Church and the Crown were often uneasy about, but could rarely effectively prevent. The Piers Plowman of William Langland, written in the 1360s and 1370s, and revised through multiple versions over the course of 2 decades, is the most sustained and the most theologically serious literary response to the social and political crises of the later Plantagenet period. A vision of a world in which the ideals of Christian community have been systematically corrupted by the sins of the powerful and the indifference of the institutions that are supposed to maintain justice, and whose demand for radical moral renewal sounds through its complex allegorical structure with an urgency that reflects the depth of the crisis that the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt and the corruption of royal governance had created. The final scandal of the Plantagenet era, which is, in some respects, the greatest of all, because it encompasses all the others and gives them their ultimate historical meaning, is the scandal of the dynasty's own end, the deposition and murder of Richard II, who was not the worst of the Plantagenet kings in any simple moral calculus, and who was certainly not the worst administrator, but who became the victim of the accumulated contradictions of a system of governance that had never resolved the fundamental question of where, ultimately, the authority to govern derived from, and what happened when those who exercised it violated the expectations of those over whom it was exercised. Henry Bolingbroke's claim to the throne in 1399 was based on a combination of hereditary right, which was genuinely arguable in his favour, given that he was the grandson of Edward III through the male line, political grievance, which was genuine and which had been shared by a substantial portion of the baronage, and military force, which was ultimately what decided the matter, and the combination of these 3 elements in the deposition of a sitting king who had been anointed with the holy oil of his coronation established a precedent that the subsequent dynasties found it impossible to confine to the specific circumstances that had produced it. The deposition of Richard II created the possibility of the deposition of Henry IV and of Henry V if he had lived long enough to become vulnerable, and of Henry VI, who was deposed twice in the course of the Wars of the Roses, and ultimately of every English monarch who was sufficiently weak or sufficiently tyrannical to make the precedent relevant, which is to say, it created in English political culture a permanent awareness that kingship was conditional in a sense that the anointing ceremony and the theology of sacral monarchy consistently denied, but that political practice had now established beyond serious dispute. The Plantagenet dynasty ended not with a military defeat or a failure of heirs in the simple biological sense, but with a failure of the political theory that had sustained it. The theory that a king who had been anointed and crowned, and who exercised power in accordance with the forms of law, however arbitrarily he interpreted those forms, possessed an authority that his subjects had no legitimate right to withdraw, and the failure of that theory was itself the product of the accumulated scandals of the 2.5 centuries that had preceded it, the murders and the corruptions and the injustices that had demonstrated, with a cumulative force that no theoretical claim could ultimately withstand, that anointing and crowning and legal form were insufficient guarantees of the kind of governance that the English baronage, and increasingly the English people more broadly, were prepared to accept as legitimate. The architecture of power in Plantagenet England was a structure built simultaneously of stone and of precedent. The castle and the charter, the garrison and the writ, and the scandals that shook this structure were themselves a form of architectural critique, revealing through their violence and their excess the load-bearing walls and the weak foundations of a political edifice that its builders had never been able to design in peace and rationality, but had constructed instead under the continuous pressure of military necessity, dynastic ambition, and the competing claims of the various constituencies whose cooperation the exercise of royal power required. The great castles that the Plantagenet kings built and maintained across England and their continental possessions, from the Tower of London and Windsor and Dover on the English side of the Channel to the Château Gaillard that Richard I constructed above the Seine at Les Andelys in 1196 and 1197 as a centerpiece of his defensive system in Normandy, were simultaneously military installations and political statements, expressions of royal authority in stone that communicated to all who saw them the permanent and unchallengeable nature of Plantagenet power, a claim that the political history of the dynasty consistently and sometimes brutally refuted. The Tower of London, which had been begun by William the Conqueror in the decade following the conquest, and which was expanded and elaborated by virtually every subsequent English king, served throughout the Plantagenet period simultaneously as a royal palace, an administrative centre, a treasury, an armoury, and a prison, and the diversity of these functions is itself revelatory of the nature of medieval royal power, which did not distinguish sharply between the spaces of governance, of residence, of financial administration, and of coercive control, but maintained all of these functions in proximity because they were, in the political theory and practice of the period, aspects of a single unified royal authority. The imprisonment of political enemies in the Tower, which became one of the defining features of later Plantagenet governance, was both a practical measure and a symbolic statement, because the Tower's impregnability made escape from it virtually impossible, and its proximity to the centre of royal administration made surveillance easy, while the association of the Tower with royal power gave the imprisonment of an important political figure within it a particular quality of definitive subordination that simple custody elsewhere could not provide. The list of those who were imprisoned in the Tower during the Plantagenet period includes archbishops and earls, foreign kings and domestic rebels, royal favourites fallen from grace, and political opponents who had overestimated the safety of their positions. And the movement of individuals into and out of the Tower's custody follows with considerable fidelity the political ups and downs of the reigns in which it occurred, making the Tower a kind of barometer of the shifting fortunes of Plantagenet political life. The fact that the Tower was also a place of execution, that the executions that occurred within or immediately adjacent to it were associated with the full weight of royal judicial authority rather than with the more public and symbolically complex rituals of execution at Tyburn or Smithfield, gave the deaths that occurred there a quality of finality and of intimate royal involvement that public executions, for all their spectacular quality, did not quite achieve. The relationship between the Plantagenet kings and the Welsh princes, which was characterised throughout the 12th and 13th centuries by a cycle of conquest, accommodation, rebellion and reconquest that ended only with the military campaigns of Edward I in the 1280s, illustrates the limits of the Plantagenet model of governance in a territory whose linguistic, cultural, and legal traditions were entirely distinct from those of England, and whose population had no stake in the institutions through which English royal authority expressed itself. The Welsh laws of Hywel Dda, which had governed Welsh society since the 10th century, and which provided a comprehensive legal code for the resolution of disputes, the regulation of family and property relations, and the governance of the Welsh kingdoms, were regarded by the Plantagenet kings and their administrators as incompatible with the common law that was being extended through the English kingdom, and the progressive replacement of Welsh law by English law in the territories that came under direct English administration was experienced by the Welsh population as a form of cultural dispossession that was inseparable from the Jarls. Political and military subjugation that accompanied it, the particular bitterness of the Welsh response to English conquest, which manifested itself in the rebellion of Madog ap Llywelyn in 1294 and 1295, just 11 years after Edward's final campaign had supposedly completed the Welsh conquest, and in the more protracted rebellion of Owain Glyndwr at the beginning of the 15th century, reflects the depth of the resentment generated by a conquest that had been conducted with a systematic cultural as well as military thoroughness that left the Welsh with no institutional framework through which to express their grievances. Within the terms of the existing political order, the financial exploitation of the Welsh territories following conquest was itself a significant scandal, because the imposition of English administrative practices upon a society organised on entirely different economic and legal principles produced a series of mismatches and injustices that the local populations experienced with immediate and direct effect. The replacement of the traditional Welsh system of renders in kind by the cash payments that the English administration required forced Welsh communities to engage with a monetary economy in ways that their social organisation had not previously demanded, and the difficulties that resulted, the inability to obtain silver currency in sufficient quantities, the manipulation of exchange rates by English merchants and officials, and the imposition of fines for breaches of administrative procedures that the Welsh population did not understand, were not experienced as the teething troubles of a new administrative system, but as deliberate instruments of extortion by a colonial power that regarded the conquered territory primarily as a source of revenue rather than as a community of people with legitimate claims upon the justice of the crown that ruled them. The experience of Scotland under the later Plantagenet kings, while sharing some features with the Welsh experience, had a fundamentally different political character, because Scotland was an independent kingdom whose institutions, including its own common law tradition, its own church, and its own feudal nobility with strong cross-border connections to England, were sufficiently developed to provide the basis for sustained national resistance in a way that the Welsh principalities, which had never achieved the political coherence of a unified kingdom, could not. The resistance to English domination that Robert Bruce organised from 1306 onward, drawing upon the institutional resources of the Scottish Church, the loyalty of a baronage whose Scottish identities had been reinforced by Edward's attempts to subordinate them, and the military skills that he developed through a decade of guerrilla warfare before the decisive victory at Bannockburn, was a national resistance, in a sense that the Welsh risings of the same period were not, because it was organised through and in defence of institutions that had the capacity to sustain political identity across the defeats and accommodations of individual military campaigns. The Treaty of Northampton of 1328, which Edward III's minority government concluded with Robert Bruce, and which recognised Scottish independence and Robert's kingship in terms that amounted to a complete English surrender of the territorial claims that Edward I had spent the last decade of his reign pursuing with such enormous expenditure of lives and treasure, was one of the most comprehensive diplomatic reversals in English medieval history, and its contemporaneous reception, which was sufficiently hostile among the English baronage to earn it the sobriquet of the shameful peace, reflects the depth of the investment that Edward I's wars had created in the English political class in the project of Scottish subjugation. Edward III's subsequent repudiation of the treaty and resumption of the Scottish wars in 1332, exploiting the faction within Scottish politics represented by the disinherited English claimants to Scottish estates, was simultaneously a response to the political pressure of those who had never accepted the Northampton settlement, and a demonstration of the extent to which the Scottish question had become embedded in English domestic politics as permanent source of baronial grievance and royal obligation. The Black Prince, who was the dominant military figure of the middle decades of Edward III's reign, and who might, had he survived his father, have been one of the most formidable of all the Plantagenet kings, was himself the centre of a scandal that illuminates the contradictions of the chivalric culture in which the Plantagenet military aristocracy had invested so much of its self-understanding. The sack of Limoges in 1370, in which the Black Prince, already seriously ill with the disease that would kill him 6 years later, ordered the systematic killing of a large proportion of the civilian population of the city following its surrender to the French, was one of the most notorious episodes of the 100 Years' War, and one that cannot be reconciled with the chivalric ideals that the Black Prince himself had done so much to embody and promote in the campaigns at Crécy and Poitiers. The Order of the Garter that his father had founded in 1348. The chronicler Jean Froissart, who was generally sympathetic to the Black Prince, and whose account of the sack of Limoges is the most detailed that survives, describes the prince as having ordered the deaths of men, women, and children in terms that his modern defenders have attempted to qualify by reference to the specific military context and the conventions governing the treatment of a town that had been taken after a siege, but that his contemporaries, at least some of them, recognized as a violation of the principles of chivalric conduct that the prince had previously embodied. The cultivation of the chivalric ideal throughout the Plantagenet period, particularly in the reigns of Edward III and Richard II, was itself a form of political management, a way of organizing the competitive violence of the aristocratic class into forms that served the interests of the crown and of the kingdom more generally, and the tournaments, the orders of chivalry, and the elaborate ceremonial culture of the Plantagenet court served simultaneously as expressions of aristocratic identity, as mechanisms of political integration, and as theatres of royal magnificence in which the king could demonstrate his superiority within the shared value system of the military class he needed to govern. The Order of the Garter, which Edward III founded in 1348, and which was explicitly modelled on the Arthurian Round Table of literary legend, provided an institutional framework for the integration of the most powerful English nobles into a shared community of honour and obligation centred on the king and its founding at Windsor, whose great hall Edward had rebuilt as the setting for chivalric festivals and tournaments, created a physical and ceremonial centre for the expression of Plantagenet royal magnificence that subsequent kings would develop and elaborate according to their own political needs and aesthetic sensibilities. Richard II's elaboration of the ceremonial culture of kingship, his investment in the visual arts, his commissioning of the Wilton diptych and the portrait now in Westminster Abbey, his cultivation of the poets Chaucer and Gower, and the unknown author of Pearl and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, his transformation of the royal household into a centre of aesthetic refinement and intellectual culture, represent the final flowering of the Plantagenet court tradition before its violent interruption in 1399, and they illuminate the extent to which the Plantagenet kings, even in the most turbulent periods of their reigns, maintained a commitment to the cultural dimensions of royal authority that went beyond the purely military and administrative concerns that necessarily dominated so much of their attention. The suggestion that Richard's investment in court culture was itself a form of political miscalculation, that it diverted attention and resources from the military and fiscal challenges that his reign required, and that it created around the king a coterie of aesthetic sensibilities that were poorly equipped to manage the brutal political realities of the later 14th century, has a certain intuitive plausibility, but probably overestimates the direct causal connection between cultural patronage and political failure, because the structural conditions that made Richard's position precarious had developed over decades and reflected systemic tensions that no amount of military competence could have resolved without also addressing the institutional innovations that his predecessors had failed to make, and that his deposition ultimately compelled his successors to confront. The legacy of the Plantagenet kings thus runs in two directions simultaneously: toward the darkness of the specific crimes and injustices that their power generated and enabled, and toward the institutional developments, the common law, the Parliament, the Charter of Liberties, the procedural protections of due process that the pressure of those crimes and the resistance they generated eventually produced. Neither direction alone captures the full historical character of the period, because the institutions cannot be understood apart from the crises that drove their development. and the crises cannot be fully understood apart from the institutional responses that they generated, because it was precisely in the dynamic between royal excess and institutional innovation, between the abuse of power and the construction of mechanisms to constrain it, that the distinctive character of English political development in the medieval period resided, and that the contribution of the Plantagenet era to the longer history of constitutional governance in the English-speaking world made. The darkness of the Plantagenet scandals is therefore not simply a backdrop against which the brighter institutional achievements of the period stand out in relief, but an essential part of the story itself, the substance from which the institutions were shaped, and the evidence from which the arguments for reform were drawn, and without which neither the arguments nor the institutions can be fully understood. The fiscal machinery of the Plantagenet state, which was developed with such systematic energy in the reign of Henry II, and which was refined and elaborated by each of his successors in response to the particular fiscal crises that their military and political ambitions generated, was simultaneously one of the most impressive administrative achievements of the medieval period, and one of the most persistent sources of popular resentment and political conflict, because the sophistication of the fiscal apparatus meant that the crown's ability to extract wealth from the kingdom outpaced, at least in the short term, the ability of those who bore the burden of that extraction to develop effective mechanisms of resistance or limitation. The Exchequer, which was the central accounting institution of English royal finance, and which had developed under the early Angevin kings into one of the most sophisticated financial administrations in the medieval West, conducted its business through a system of audit that was remarkable for its thoroughness and its institutional memory, maintaining accounts that ran in unbroken series from 1156 onward, and that constitute one of the most extraordinary runs of continuous administrative documentation in the history of any state. The very thoroughness of this record-keeping, which makes the Plantagenet fiscal administration so recoverable by modern historians, also made the systematic abuses of that administration increasingly difficult to conceal from those in a position to scrutinize the accounts, and the periodic audits of sheriff's accounts, the occasional investigations of fiscal corruption, and the mounting pressures toward parliamentary oversight of taxation all reflect the extent to which the efficiency of the fiscal machinery created its own mechanisms of accountability, even as it enabled the abuses that those mechanisms were designed to control. The relationship between the Plantagenet kings and the English Church evolved through the period in ways that reflected the broader development of both royal governance and ecclesiastical organization, and the scandals that arose from this relationship were embedded in structural tensions that no individual agreement or institutional arrangement was capable of permanently resolving. The question of who appointed bishops and abbots, which had been at the heart of the investiture controversy that had convulsed the relationship between secular and ecclesiastical power across Western Europe in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, and which had been formally addressed in England by the Concordat of London in 1107, remained in practice a source of conflict throughout the Plantagenet period, because the formal compromise that the Concordat had established, by which the Church maintained the spiritual investiture while the Crown maintained a significant role in the selection process, left ample room for the kind of jurisdictional disputes that both sides were temperamentally inclined to pursue whenever the interests of a specific appointment made it worthwhile. Henry II's dispute with Beckett over the constitutions of Clarendon was in this sense not an isolated conflict between two difficult personalities, but the most dramatic expression of a structural tension that had been present in the English ecclesiastical polity since the Conquest, and that would remain present in various forms until the Reformation finally resolved it in favour of the Crown by the simple expedient of making the Crown the head of the Church. The wealth of the English Church, which was enormous by any contemporary standard, was a permanent object of royal fiscal attention throughout the Plantagenet period, and the methods by which the Crown extracted revenue from ecclesiastical sources, through the vacancies of sees and abbacies whose revenues fell to the Crown during the period between one bishop's death and his successor's appointment, through the taxation of clerical incomes that required increasingly elaborate papal authorization, and through the informal pressures of royal favour and royal displeasure that could make or break a bishop's practical ability to govern his diocese, were experienced by the Church as a continuous threat to the institutional autonomy that was the foundation of its pastoral authority. The prolonged vacancies that Henry II and subsequent Plantagenet kings maintained deliberately in wealthy sees, keeping the bishop's chair empty for months or years in order to collect the revenues that would otherwise have gone to an episcopal household, were documented by contemporary chroniclers as acts of deliberate ecclesiastical exploitation that violated the Church's claim to govern its own institutions, and the conflicts that these practices generated with successive popes who sought to impose their own candidates on vacant English sees were a recurrent feature of the diplomatic landscape of the entire dynasty's history. The intellectual culture of the Plantagenet period, which produced not only the legal and administrative achievements for which the era is rightly celebrated, but also a philosophical and theological tradition of considerable sophistication, was itself engaged with the questions of justice, legitimacy, and the limits of power that the political scandals of the period most directly raised, and the attempts of scholastic philosophers and canon lawyers to provide theoretical frameworks for understanding when royal authority might be resisted or limited, represent one of the most significant intellectual contributions of the era to the longer history of political thought. John of Salisbury, who served in the circle of Thomas Beckett and who had studied at the great schools of Paris before returning to England, wrote in his Polycraticus of 1159 a comprehensive theory of political authority that included a famous discussion of tyrannicide, the legitimacy of killing a king who had become a tyrant, which drew upon classical sources and upon a careful reading of biblical precedent to argue that a ruler who exercised power arbitrarily and without regard for the common good had forfeited the sacred character that legitimate kingship possessed and had become subject to the same moral judgment as any other criminal. The Polycraticus was written in the period immediately before the Beckett conflict reached its catastrophic conclusion, and while John of Salisbury did not intend it as a direct commentary on Henry II's governance, the proximity of its composition to the events that followed gives its theoretical analysis of tyranny and legitimate resistance a resonance that its author could not entirely have anticipated. The tradition of political philosophy that John of Salisbury represents, and that was developed through the 13th and 14th centuries by a succession of scholastic thinkers engaged with the questions of natural law, just governance, and the foundation of political authority, provided the intellectual framework within which the practical innovations of Magna Carta and parliamentary development could be understood and justified, and without which the constitutional claims of those who resisted Plantagenet overreach would have lacked the theoretical coherence that gave them their lasting significance. The argument that the king was subject to law rather than simply its source, that the exercise of royal power was conditional upon its conformity with the divine and natural law that transcended any particular sovereign's will, and that the subjects of a king who systematically violated the conditions of legitimate rule had a right, and in some formulations a duty, to resist that violation, were arguments that drew upon the accumulated resources of Roman law, canon law, and scholastic theology to give intellectual substance to political positions that were also driven by the immediate interests and grievances of those who advanced them. The relationship between intellectual argument and political practice in the Plantagenet period is therefore one of genuine mutual influence, in which the practical experience of governance and resistance provided the political philosophers with their subject matter, and the theoretical frameworks that the philosophers developed provided the political actors with arguments that shaped the forms and the justifications of their resistance. The contribution of the Plantagenet era to the development of English language and literature, which was itself intertwined with the political and cultural scandals of the period in ways that are not always recognized in accounts that treat literature as a separate domain from politics, deserves particular emphasis as one of the most enduring and least ambiguous of the dynasty's legacies. The transition of English from the vernacular of a conquered people, whose language had been displaced by Norman French as the language of the court, the the law and the church in the decades following the conquest, to the dominant, literary, and eventually administrative language of the kingdom, was a process that extended through the entire Plantagenet period, and whose completion is conventionally associated with the generation of Chaucer, Langland, and the Gawain poet in the later 14th century, but whose foundations were laid by the administrative and cultural developments of the preceding 2 centuries. The Ancrine Wyss, the Owl and the Nightingale, the Brut of Laemant, the various saints' lives and devotional texts produced in English throughout the 13th century, represent stages in a process by which English was being developed as a vehicle for complex thought and literary sophistication, even during the period of its political marginalization, and the eventual triumph of English as the language of governance and literature in the later Plantagenet period reflects both the demographic and social reality of a kingdom in which the majority of the population had always spoken English, and the cultural and political realignments of the 100 Years' War, which made the French language a mark of enemy identity rather than of civilized refinement. The Plantagenet era, considered in its full scope from the accession of Henry II in 1154 to the deposition of Richard II in 1399, was therefore a period of extraordinary complexity and significance, in which the darkest acts of individual and institutional violence existed alongside the most consequential institutional and cultural innovations of the medieval period, and in which the connection between the darkness and the innovations was not accidental but structural, because it was precisely the experience of what unconstrained power could produce that generated the pressure for the constraints that would shape English governance for centuries to come. The scandals of this era are not merely historical curiosities or opportunities for the retrospective moral judgment that hindsight makes so easy and historical complexity makes so difficult, but evidence of the specific conditions under which the institutions of constitutional governance were forged in England, and of the human cost at which that forging was accomplished. A cost paid not by the kings and barons who shaped the major political narratives, but by the far larger and far less visible populations of ordinary English, Welsh, Scottish, and Jewish people, upon whose labour, obedience, and suffering the entire magnificent and terrible structure of Plantagenet power ultimately rested. The chroniclers who recorded these events, men who worked by candlelight in the scriptoria of English monasteries, and who shaped their accounts according to the theological and institutional frameworks that their training provided, were themselves participants in the process of historical meaning-making that the scandals of the Plantagenet era generated, and their decisions about what to record and what to omit, what to explain and what to leave as bare factual statement, what moral framework to apply to the behavior they described, and what forms of evidence to credit or discount, determined the form in which the history of the period has been transmitted to subsequent generations and the categories through which it has been understood. The chronicle tradition of Plantagenet England, which includes some of the most detailed and sophisticated historical writing of the medieval period, reflects an engagement with questions of power, justice, and moral responsibility that goes beyond the simple recording of events, and that constitutes in itself a form of political and theological reflection upon the experience of living in a kingdom where extraordinary institutional achievement and extraordinary moral failure existed in permanent and uncomfortable proximity. Roger of Wendover's Flores Historiarum, continued and substantially rewritten by Matthew Paris as the Chronica Majora, represents the apex of this tradition, a work of historical synthesis that draws upon oral testimony, documentary evidence, personal observation, and the accumulated record of previous chronicle writing to produce an account of the 13th century that is simultaneously a work of genuine scholarship and a sustained moral argument about the proper relationship between royal power and the demands of justice, an argument whose conclusions were shaped by the institutional position of St. Albans, but whose evidence was drawn from the actual experience of English governance in all its complexity and contradiction. The physical landscape of England was itself transformed by the Plantagenet period in ways that are still visible. The great cathedrals that the church built and the crown sponsored, the castle networks that military governance required, the the market towns that royal charters created and that commercial development sustained, the forests that the royal hunting preserves protected and that subsequent clearance gradually reduced, all bearing the marks of the specific decisions and the specific priorities of the men who governed England from 1154 to 1399. Westminster Abbey, which Henry III rebuilt in the Gothic style as a monument to royal piety and dynastic ambition, drawing upon the revenues of the kingdom to create what was intended to be the finest expression of royal magnificence in the English-speaking world, stands today as the most complete surviving expression of the Plantagenet royal aesthetic, a building that embodies simultaneously the genuine religious devotion that motivated its patron and the political calculation that shaped its design, a structure whose beauty is inseparable from the financial and administrative pressures that its construction imposed upon the kingdom that paid for it. The choir of Canterbury Cathedral, rebuilt after the fire of 1174 in a style that reflected the influence of continental Gothic architecture and that created the architectural setting for the shrine of Thomas Beckett, is perhaps the most historically loaded building of the Plantagenet era, a space that was simultaneously a monument to the archbishop who had died resisting royal overreach and a memorial to the royal penance that had sought to repair the political and spiritual damage of that death, and whose eventual destruction by Henry VIII 6 centuries later would close the circle of the conflict that Beckett's murder had opened. The enduring significance of the Plantagenet scandals for the history of English political thought and practice cannot be measured simply in terms of the specific institutional innovations to which they contributed, though that contribution was considerable and lasting, but must also account for the way in which the experience of these scandals shaped the political imagination of the English people and the political culture of the English state across the centuries that followed the dynasties, and the invocations of Magna Carta that appear in the 17th century, conflicts between Parliament and the Stuart kings, the use of Plantagenet precedents in the arguments of John Hampden and his allies against ship money, the appeal to the ancient constitution that parliamentary lawyers deployed against the royal prerogative claims of Charles I, all drew upon an understanding of the Plantagenet period as the foundational era of English constitutional governance, an understanding that was, in many respects, historically simplified and ideologically motivated, but that was not entirely without foundation, because the institutional innovations of the Plantagenet period, however imperfectly they functioned in their original context, and however far they fell short of the aspirations that the 17th century attributed to them, did represent genuine responses to genuine abuses that had created lasting precedents for the principle that power in England was and ought to be subject to law. The Plantagenet era was thus not merely a chapter in the history of medieval England, but the formative experience from which the distinctive tradition of English constitutional governance grew, an experience whose darkness was inseparable from its significance and whose legacy, both institutional and moral, continues to shape the political culture of the English-speaking world in ways that the men who lived through it could not have imagined, and that those who study it continue to illuminate. The scandals documented here belong not only to the history of a distant dynasty, but to the deeper history of how human societies learn, slowly and painfully and never finally, to govern themselves with something approaching justice, and that history is one in which the Plantagenet era occupies a chapter of enduring and irreducible importance.